Okay. Uh, okay. It's time. Wild, you made it. Wild. The hard reset for your sleep schedule. And Rad. Oh my goodness. These are my two favorite pals. Yeah, we like hard napped this morning, which was actually really nice. It's nice to have a little nappy bappy. Excuse me. I'll try and mute for when I have to cough occasionally. Alrighty. I don't see why we can't just get right into it. I just need to get a couple of cute black lab pictures. Here's a good one. Oh, this one's really good. Okay. Gv. Dorgy. Now let's do one. Smiling. They're all looking so serious in all these pictures on Google. Come on. Give me a big chocolate or black lab smile. Mm. Mm-mm-mm. This'll do. Doogie. Wee woo, wee woo. It is an astounding 10 degrees in Toronto, Canada. It is a summer day, or it is a late spring day. We had our little breakfast out on the balcony. All the windows are open. Actually, the balcony's closed again. I might change that soon. It is nuts. I don't want to pull an all nighter, but when 9 a.m. rolled around, you still wasn't asleep. You might as well just not sleep. Yeah. Now that we have like a nice kind of comfy living room setup, I almost look forward to a bad night's sleep because it means I can just go out there and watch like a bunch of shitty meme compilation videos or like play a video game. Well, I hope your sleep schedule is fixed with this time around. Hopefully, you'll fall asleep to my soothing voice. And I don't know how it keeps happening, but every time this current commissioner gets something, they love giving gifts to their friends, which is so sweet. But I always have to make it into like a short sequence, and I don't think I have any reason to break with tradition today because this is a very cute character that they're gifting for. And I would like to see her in sequence. That sounded kind of weird. Don't think about that too hard. Today, you're a mod here. You could kill everybody if you wanted to. Wild, you could also kill anybody you wanted to. I'm doing great. I'm sleeping great. Except for the cute baby nap I had this morning. Let me pull up. We were listening to a lot of History of Byzantium yesterday, and I don't see why we should break with tradition again. So I'm actually going to start us off with the first episode from the History of Byzantium podcast. Because I have zero brain cells and I need to be listening to something at all times or else I'll die. But this is a really great podcast. You can also find it on like an actual podcast um, app, like Acast, I guess, if Acast still exists, or Google Podcasts, whatever. But very good. Can be kind of dry, but in a good way. On his Patreon, he has slightly more like day in the life style episodes as well, but it's like $9 to get in per month. So I think that's worth it for me to just go in and just have a solid month of listening to really, really good episodes. But this one is one of the free episodes. You have to let me know if it's loud enough. Gianni Waiting Room stream, very real. It is a rough start this morning. I have not warmed up with some drawings. Let's just dumb this down a little bit. Let's make this into more stylized figure. Hey, Comrade Corvus. Hey, speak of the devil. Your own doodles. Yes, come, bring your doodles. Empty OJ just finished an animation. Hell yeah. Sorry, just adjusting my desk. Don't mind me. This is how Goth GF started. They wanted to overthrow Rome. That's so base of them. The wretched organ. Oh. A speedy recovery from Shark Week. Me when I stamp you out. I think we know what have to do. There we go. We gotta get the real reference here. Thunk. Ugh. Alright. Well, well, well. What a nice system. Imagine if they actually did that here, today. She's twisting one way, but I want to show the impact of the thing by putting her jowls this way. Oh, you know what? Oh my gosh, really? This whole time? I've been listening to it the whole time.
In other words, men began to retreat.
It's been so good listening to this podcast completely alone, muted, so you guys can't listen to it. Let's try this again. I've been reacting to it this whole time too. I'm insane. This Byzantium podcast is real quiet. That's what I get for fucking streaming ever.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the History
I love being
of
the worst
Byzantium,
streamer on this
episode 1A, an introduction.
Yeah, totally.
This episode is being recorded in early 2015, 3 years after the podcast launched. The History of Byzantium is a series that continues the narrative of the History of Rome podcast by Mike Duncan. The purpose of this episode is to offer a quick introduction to the series.
We call that when his face gets stuck on his face.
To the History of Rome. And of course I do recommend that you do. It's an amazing series. But I appreciate that it's 179 episodes long, and you may just want to dive into the Byzantine story.
Do her hair for this shot.
So today I'm going to try and tell you a few important things that you need to know to become quickly immersed in the narrative of politics and theology that the regular episodes present. As we begin, I'm going to assume that you know the outline of the story of Roman history. That the city-state of Rome grew from its mythical origins in 750 BC into a republic, which began to politically dominate the other states of Italy. By about 250 BC, Rome essentially controlled all of modern Italy. A series of major wars with the Carthaginians, Hannibal and his elephants and all of that, led to the Romans picking up a number of overseas colonies. These started around the Mediterranean basin, but soon men like Julius Caesar and his nephew Augustus dragged France, Spain, the whole of the North African coast, Palestine, Syria, Turkey, and the Balkans into the empire. By the time Augustus died in AD 14, the rough boundaries of the Roman world were set. A few more areas like Britain were added later, but the basis of the empire was around the Mediterranean. Transport by sea was so much cheaper than land that the Mediterranean
sometimes his cheek would get caught in his
the
mouth if he
economic
barked.
integration of Europe.
Terminally silly
Spices and
puppers.
silks could arrive in Egypt or Syria and be shipped to France and Italy. Grain
My favorite is
fed
when
the
they
giant
just wake up and
metropolis
like
of
Rennie
Rome,
will
and
have one
intellectuals,
piece of her mouth
laborers,
underneath
and soldiers could zip around
and
the
look
Roman
so
world
frickin'
in a way
stupid.
which made the empire possible.
Stupid. Don't these dogs know they look stupid?
Any real
So
introduction to
cute.
Byzantine history begins with what is often called the crisis of the 3rd century. The 2nd century AD is often thought of as the golden age of the empire. Men like Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius ruled the empire at a time when the Roman army could dominate its enemies, the disunited German tribes north of the Rhine and Danube rivers, and the Parthian Empire, based in Iraq and Iran, to the east of the Syrian desert. The economy was solid, with the odd conquest bringing in a fresh influx of slaves and gold, and generally, if you lived near the Mediterranean, your family might have been untouched by war for several generations.
Oh, how nice.
That all began to change during the 3rd century.
Right.
The power and dominance of Rome forced those outside the empire to improve their military capabilities. The German tribes, for example, would trade with the Romans and could see the vast riches on offer inside the empire. Some wanted to take it by force. Some wanted a better trade deal. Some wanted to migrate there. The constant friction of living next door to such sheltered wealth saw the German tribes slowly develop what are called super confederations. Men put aside their local rivalries to accept the overlordship of one king. This is how groups formed that give us the famous names of the Franks, the Goths, and the Vandals.
Okay, well, again, that's how
Meanwhile,
our big
over in
titty
Iran,
goth GF
a
started. They
Persian
wanted to overthrow
aristocrat
Rome.
called Ardashir
back
overthrew the
there again.
Parthian king and began to reform that state into the Sassanid Empire, or Persian Empire. Better utilizing the resources of his domains and determined to prove his right to rule with victories over the Romans, Ardashir and his successors began to make periodic war on the Roman Empire and more than held their own on the battlefield. At the same time that the enemies on the frontiers were becoming stronger, the Romans suffered from two very nasty bouts of plague, possibly smallpox and measles.
Skill issue.
This all led to a series of military disasters and constant political coups. Dozens of emperors and would-be emperors came and went as the armies marched around, stamping out these fires. The man who emerged to reform the Roman state was the Emperor Diocletian. He determined that the empire needed many more soldiers to protect the frontiers, and therefore needed more tax revenue to pay for them. Diocletian set up a far more complicated and professional bureaucracy than had existed before. He also split the job of emperor into four, so that each corner of the empire could have a military and political leader on hand to deal with the various crises in their region. One of Diocletian's successors, Constantine, would do away with this system. In a series of bloody civil wars, he reunited the empire under his rule in the early 300s AD. However, several important changes had taken place, which began to show us the classical Roman Empire morphing into something more recognizably like the medieval Byzantine state. The rise of the Roman Republic was based in part on the fact that men competed with one another for political prominence. This meant that the wealthy used their own money to build public buildings, throw entertainments, and maintain the roads.
I'm sleepy,
They would
but
also
still greeting
compete
you.
for military commands, a prestigious and necessary part
Hey,
of political
all day, all
advancement.
night. We're doing great.
And this type of behavior was common across the cities of the Mediterranean, thanks to the spread of Greek culture
Yeah,
under
isn't
Alexander the
plague
Great
like
and his
specifically supposed to
successors.
be like the Black Plague? Don't
So
worry,
when
we
the
got
Roman
another couple
Empire was
centuries before
formed,
that hits the shores.
The emperors could
In fact, we
rely
could
on
skip
the fact
straight to that
men
after
in the
this episode.
provinces already were administrators,
It's horrific,
army officers, and politicians. And more to the point,
but also a skill issue.
they
I
wanted
would
to
simply be fine.
that's how men made their names and their fortunes. But things had now changed. Centuries of peace within the Roman world meant that wealthy men didn't need to serve in the army to make money. Then the raids of the Goths and the Vandals fractured the sense of security that had led men to live in towns with no walls. And the easygoing tax regime of the early empire was replaced by the imperial bureaucrat, carefully evaluating your wealth. In other words, men began to retreat from the old ways of political participation. They kept their money to themselves. They made sure that their sons avoided a hard military life, and they stayed at home instead of going into town.
Well, only one of those things
That's
is
a
not
huge
based.
simplification, of course. Men and women, for example, did still get together, but instead of the forum or the theatre, increasingly it was the church which drew in the crowds. Since his death in the 30s AD, the worship of Jesus Christ had spread throughout the empire. It had gathered pace during the 3rd century and was officially endorsed as the religion of the Roman state by Constantine, who became a Christian himself. And even though Constantine reunited the empire under one ruler, he couldn't do away with the realities that had pushed Diocletian to split the empire into quarters.
That's my
The
friend.
empire still had dangerous frontiers in different places. This had meant that, for example,
This is
Rome,
such an
a city
inconsistent style
hundreds
today,
of miles
but,
from these trouble spots, had become far
Shoot,
less
shoot.
relevant
We'll
by
hammer
the
it
4th
out.
century.
Hammer it out in the next layer.
None of Diocletian's colleagues worked from the imperial city, instead preferring fortified towns closer to the empire's edges. Constantine saw the need for a new capital for himself, both to place him closer to the frontiers and to be free of the old pagan cults, so that his new Christian worship could have a centre of its own.
Get out of here.
This brings us
Pagan
to
cults.
Byzantium. Modern Istanbul is built on the last piece of land in Mediterranean Europe before you reach Asia. The city which occupied this vital crossing was the Greek city of Byzantium. Thanks to a unique inlet of seawater, the city had the virtually unique position of being surrounded on three sides by water.
Oider.
This meant that only one land wall was needed to keep an invader out. Constantine's shrewd eye could see the basis for a city that no Goth or Persian would be able to sack.
No goth?
Construction began, and the city was consecrated by the emperor in 324 AD.
Pal.
When Constantine died, his successors reluctantly returned to a political division of the empire. Rather than 4, more often 2 emperors would now rule, one in the west and one in the east, the latter ruling from Constantinople, the city of Constantine. This practical division is what leads to the decline and fall of the Roman Empire in the west and the survival of the east, which historians have come to call the Byzantine Empire. The Eastern Empire had several advantages over its western half. Despite the powerful threat which the Sassanid Persians presented, this was also the source of much wealth as traders made their way down the Silk Road through Persia to Syria, or ships came around Arabia to Egypt. The fertility of the Nile Valley was also a key asset. It brought an annual surplus of grain that could feed the population of Constantinople.
I fucking love grain. I fucking
And in
love grain.
general,
I love
the
grain.
East survived the transition from the crisis of the 3rd century better than the West. Its cities were less exposed to the German tribes. Its trade networks were more ancient and deeply
Germans
embedded
once
than
again
those in the
being
West.
killjoys.
And above all, Constantinople stood solidly untouched by the sackings and pillaging which other cities suffered. This meant that the new imperial bureaucracy had a safe base to work from, and this new source of employment drew ambitious
That was
and
your
intelligent men
character yesterday,
into the
Mr.
service
Action?
of the state.
Excellent.
Meanwhile, in the
Character
West,
design.
the poorer and less secure towns were abandoned in the face of
Common
increasing
Corvus is a real
German
Chad.
immigration.
Gotta say.
Rome itself was sacked twice, and
Don't you
barbarian
mean
kingdoms
Istanbul? I am
sprouted up,
hilarious.
while the
Very.
regiments of the Western Army dwindled away. So in 476 AD, the German warlord Odoacer simply relieved the last Western Roman emperor of his office. German military commanders now began making themselves king in France, Spain, and Italy, while the Romans of the East, the Byzantines, continued business as usual. And what kind of business was this by 476 AD? It was an increasingly Christian world, for a start. The rabble-rousing preachers and bishops of Alexandria and Antioch had become the great men of their day. Theological arguments dominated intellectual discussion and could turn violent. The government in Constantinople was run on the basis of access and influence over the emperor. This meant in practice that the palace became a place of intrigue and backstabbing. The various administrative office holders would vie with imperial princesses, barbarian generals, and eunuchs of the bedchamber to gain the emperor's ear. The emperors were now distant, semi-divine figures. Long gone were the days when Augustus might dine with the family of a leading aristocrat. The emperor now only left the palace to take part in a procession or go to church. They almost never went out on campaign themselves. Meanwhile, out in the streets of the capital, the population was developing a sense of its own importance in matters of state and theology. The passion of the crowds could be turned to loud demonstrations or even arsonist riots should they strongly disagree with imperial policy.
Ah, bring back riots.
They were the people of the
Bring
Christian
back
capital of the world,
Byzantine
after all,
riots right now.
and they revelled in their outspokenness.
I still
The
love how
language of the
Rome was
East
like,
was
we hate
increasingly
Jesus and killed him, and
Greek
then
and
Rome
little
became the
else.
center of Christianity.
The
Yeah.
spread of Christianity had seen Greek come to replace most local dialects, and slowly Latin was seeping out of official circles. The East,
Germans are weenies.
like the
That's why we
West,
scared
had
them
come
so
to
much in
rely
both World Wars.
increasingly
So-
on German
by we, I mean
troops to
Canadians,
run
so
its
true.
armies. Most of the Eastern field armies had German commanders during the 5th century. It only made sense given that the best fighting men were of German stock. But this meant that there was a very real danger that the East could go the same way as the West. In fact, the Eastern Empire almost fell into such a crisis as our story begins.
Crop top supremacy.
When the Emperor Theodosius died unexpectedly in 450,
Skill issue.
there was no rightful successor in place to take over.
Skill issue.
The Emperor's sister Pulcheria was the closest blood relative to the throne,
She's a woman,
and she
though.
was determined to maintain her own power at court. She made a deal with one of those barbarian generals,
Actually,
Aspar,
Byzantines did have
and married
empresses.
one of his lieutenants, a man of Roman birth, named Marcian. Marcian would prove to be a decent emperor, but he was in his 60s when his reign began, and by 457 he and Pulcheria had both died of natural causes. This left no obvious imperial candidate, and Aspar, the barbarian general, now held all the power. This was a crucial moment for the empire, and it's where our story begins. Would Aspar's choice of successor cement him in power, or prove to be his undoing? Find out on episode 2 of the History of Byzantium.
Okay, the audio quality is about to make a huge dramatic downturn. Because, again, that episode was recorded in 2015 and the other ones were in 2012, so we'll see how horrific it is. Oh, he is completely out of order. Okay, well, you guys want to learn about the Nika Revolt? It's got, like, the first episode and then it skips to episode 20. Oh my god. Who cares? We'll just learn miscellaneous stuff about Byzantine Empire.
Hello, everyone.
I've been told
And
that the
welcome
Canadians
to
store
the
their
history
bloodlust
of
in the geese during
Byzantium.
peacetime. Is that true? It's extremely
Episode
true.
20.
Yes, confirmed.
The Nika Revolt.
I'm actually going to put that in the hall of chat.
Today we reach an event which pulls together many of the elements of the Byzantine story, which we've covered in our first 20 episodes. In episode 3 we saw citizens of Constantinople hurling bricks from their roofs in support of an insurrection. In episode 4 we heard the clamour of the Demes turn to riot after riot as Anastasius's reign was peppered with civil disturbance.
If you fucking say so.
In episode 5 we saw the emperor take off his diadem and offer to leave office to calm the crowd. In episode 10 we walked the streets of Constantinople, visiting its famous monuments and noting that many open hearths plus many wooden structures does not make for a fire marshal's dream. Finally,
How to
in
trigger
the
a
last
fire
3
guy.
episodes, we've seen the discontent stirred up by the policies of Justinian, a discontent that had spread through every echelon in society. As January of 532 arrives, it feels like the history of Byzantium, as well as the reign of Justinian, has reached a critical moment. The new year was usually a time for races in Constantinople. The consular games took place in the first week, and by the second, it was time for games to mark the Ides of January. Around the 10th of the month, the Greens and Blues ended up in yet another fight during the races, and several people...
Sorry. For context, the Greens and the Blues were two opposing, I think, chariot racing teams. But they also kind of had political affiliations. I think the Greens were, like, more liberal and the Blues were, like, more conservative. Whatever that means back in fucking, the year 500 or whatever. Just so you know.
people were killed. Justinian sent soldiers in to restore order, and by Sunday the 11th,
The Vermin
city
Supreme
prefect,
Chariot Team,
Eudaimon,
yes!
sentenced 7 members of the Demes to death. These were known violent criminals, and they were a mixture of greens and blues. So Justinian probably didn't think anything unusual
Funny.
was taking place. Since becoming emperor, he'd abandoned his favoritism toward the blues, and conspicuously dealt even-handed justice to the Demes. Despite this, though, little had changed in their attitude toward him. The Greens were still resentful of their mistreatment in the previous decade, and the Blues still assumed that they had friends in high places.
Oh dear.
5 of the executions were carried out efficiently, but something went wrong with the final 2 men. Their hanging was botched,
and both fell to the ground still alive. The execution site stood next to the monastery of St. Conon, and some monks who were watching gathered up the fallen men and rowed them across the Golden Horn to the church of St. Lawrence. When he heard what had happened, Eudaimon sent guards to
Listen,
retrieve
okay, I'm going to explain something really fast here. If you have a bad hangman and that happens, I don't care what you did. If it's fucked up, I think maybe that's divine intervention. Maybe those monks were in the right. That's just my opinion, though.
the escapees.
As a non-secular person.
But the principle of a church being a place of sanctuary had already taken hold in Christian Byzantium, and the guards had to wait outside and aim
so
to starve
cute.
the men out. One of them was a blue, and the other a green.
Holy shit.
The guards would not move on Monday,
Do you think
as
they
the
made
leadership
love?
of the Deems asked for them to be released. And by Tuesday,
Do you think they were
tensions were
boyfriends by
running
the end of
high
this?
as the hippodrome filled for the races to mark the Ides. Justinian was present in the
Peak
imperial
political
box
debate. Hang both of them.
Kathisma, and both factions said loud
In Minecraft,
prayers,
Twitch, in Minecraft.
begging him to be lenient and release the two men. These calls for indulgences from the emperor were clearly a common part of city life, and considering Justinian's stance of impartiality, it seemed likely to the crowd that he would grant freedom to the two men and please both sides. To their dismay, though, no positive word came back from the imperial officials.
Fuck those guys, he said.
The Blues seem to have been particularly angered by this refusal, perhaps realizing that the emperor really had turned his back on them. The leadership of both factions had clearly conferred by the time of the 22nd race of the day, as an organized cry went up of "Long live the merciful Blues and Greens." Perhaps together their clamour would convince the emperor. By the end of the races, the Deems began to chant as one the word Nika, meaning victory or conquer. Usually one faction would be chanting about their victory in the races, taunting the other side.
I'm doing well, Major
Now
Madness.
Justinian
How
looked
are you?
down on thousands of people chanting as one and pointing at him. Nika, Nika, Nika. It must have been a deeply unnerving sight and sound.
No. Skill
The
issue.
emperor retired to the palace, but the crowd's blood was up, and a mob descended on the praetorium where the city prefect worked. They demanded the release of their compatriots from St. Lawrence's. The officials inside could give no answer, and so the crowd stormed the building, killing several people, releasing all the criminals who were being held inside,
Oh, it's fine.
and then setting fire to it.
Criminals in Byzantium, would they steal a honey cake?
Thrilled with their success, the crowd now raced to the Augur
Were their
Steion
robes a
to
little too
further
short?
demonstrate their anger. They targeted the palace gate, the Chalk, and set it on fire. The fire burnt, and the gate began to crumble. But the Augur Steion was not a large courtyard, and a wind blew north, spreading the flames across to the Senate House and to
wait.
the Hagia Sophia.
Wait.
By the next morning, both had burnt to the ground.
Wait.
The church was the cathedral of the city, and had been built by Theodosius II over a century earlier. I have posted
Feeling a little
map
conflicted
of the
about this
palace
base
district
workers riot.
at thehistoryofbyzantium.wordpress.com if you want to follow the action.
I guess it's not a worker. This based
As
sports
devastating
riot.
as that
The
might
last
sound,
good sports riot.
fires were a common occurrence in Constantinople, and for that matter, so were riots. Justinian was alarmed, but not seriously so. The Blues and Greens were always at each other's throats. Their
No
alliance wouldn't
bad
last 24
deal.
hours, and then things
It's
would
going
return
well,
to
thank
normal.
you. How are you?
On the Wednesday morning, the emperor gave instructions that the races should continue, and hopefully the competition between colours would help restore the status quo. However, the crowd which appeared in the hippodrome was angry to see that no concessions were forthcoming, and soon the north end of the great stadium was set alight.
We're gonna
The
set more of your
Augustaion
stupid
was
shit on
targeted
fire.
again, with its porticos being badly burnt, and the fires soon began to spread. This time, Their victims included the giant baths of Zeuxippus, which stood between the hippodrome and the palace. Rioters and palace officials alike looked on in horror as the baths collapsed into a great smouldering heap.
Okay, folks, maybe it's
The
time to wrap
baths
it
were
up.
much older than the Hagia Sophia, and had been adorned by Constantine himself with beautiful sculptures from across the empire. Carved mosaics and around 80 statues of major figures from the Greco-Roman past were all gone, forever. Justinian now began to realize the extent of the unfolding rebellion. His officials arrived soon after with messages from the leadership of the now united Green Blues. Their demands had moved on from the simple release of their fellow demesmen. Now they wanted the removal from office of 3 senior officials. Eudaemon, the city prefect, was an obvious target, but interestingly, the other 2 names were Trebonian and John the Cappadocian. This was the first hint to those in the palace that the rioters were receiving input from other sources. The Demes were known to take issue with local law enforcement, but it was unusual that they would attempt to remove the Praetorian prefect, or the quaestor. Those with real bones to pick with John and Trebonian were the senators, or the impoverished provincials who had headed to the capital in the face of the new tax schemes. Regardless of his suspicions as to who might be involved, Justinian was seriously spooked, and agreed to replace all 3 men. Their successors were announced instantly, each a deliberately popular choice, including a certain Phocas, who was renowned throughout the city for his honesty and probity. However, instead of appeasing the leadership of the revolt, these concessions fed their ambitions. The rebels decided to crown their own emperor. The natural candidates for the job were the nephews of Anastasius. It had only been 14 years since he passed away, and all 3 men lived in the capital. Hypatius and Pompeius were safely out of reach, up in the palace. A large group of senators had fled there after the initial disturbance, and so the choice fell on the remaining nephew, Probus. However, when the crowds reached his
No way,
home,
that's his name.
they were informed that he had, very wisely, left the city when he saw which way the wind was blowing. His house was burnt down by the frustrated rebels.
What did they do? They burned it down. So based.
Justinian grew increasingly restless up in the palace. Historians
We're
have
just gonna call
surmised that
this
some of the
anatomically
senators
accurate
taking
and
refuge
move
with
on.
him were secretly sending
It's fine.
messages to the leadership of the Green Blues,
Cover it by hair.
promising money and encouraging them to unseat the upstart sovereign. As we saw last episode, Justinian and his officials were deeply unpopular with the rich, and this was a golden opportunity for them to harness the anger of the crowds to get themselves a ruler more to their liking. Justinian had more to worry about than his house guests, though. He had little faith in the palace
Probus.
regiments, the Scholares,
The
and the
Plimbus.
Excubators. He had done little to engender their loyalty, and had sold off posts in the guard to raise cash. He was increasingly surrounded by men he suspected might throw him to the wolves outside. There were a number of men he felt he could trust, though. Obviously John and Trebonian, whose fate was now linked to his, but also Belisarius, who was in the city waiting reassignment, and Mundus, the Gepid prince who was passing through on his way back to the Balkans. Belisarius had his Bacalarii with him, and Mundus's retinue included a company of heralds. Between them, they probably had about 1,500 men, who now stood at the gates, protecting those in
You
the
and I have
palace
1,500
from
men.
the mob outside.
Cool.
The next day, Thursday, Belisarius led the assorted soldiers out to confront the crowds outside the gates, and bitter fighting took place around the Augusteion. The professional soldiers inflicted nasty casualties on the rioters, but didn't have the strength to cow the far greater numbers. Belisarius was forced to return to the palace, leaving the rebels further enraged by their emperor. More buildings were burnt down as the city's clergy made futile attempts to restore order. For the next 3 days, the city was engulfed in street fights and arson. On Friday, the mob set fire to the Praetorium again, as it had only been partly burnt by the initial fire. Whether by accident or design, soon the baths of Alexander were destroyed.
They keep
Then
roasting the
Hospice of
baths.
Eblis,
They're gonna get so
The
stinky.
church of Hagia Irene, and the hospice of Samson.
Okay, but
Many
also
private houses and apartments went up
all
in
these
smoke
nice
too.
historical buildings. Oh dear.
Business had stopped taking place. Smoke hung in the air. Those who had somewhere to go fled the city. At some point, Justinian gave orders for boats to be manned and prepared should he need to flee. By Saturday, some more troops arrived by ship from local cities. With his numbers bolstered, Belisarius set out from the palace again and made battle with the mob in the quarters of the Chalcopraetor, near the basilica. The mob had occupied a nearby building known as the Octagon, which was also set on fire during the fighting. The flames spread south this time,
I wonder what that looks like.
destroying the palace of Lausus. The palace was filled with treasures which were consumed or melted down, and the church
Palace
of
of
St.
Lausus.
Theodorus Feratius went next. The fire raged along the Mysae towards the Forum of Constantine, destroying everything in its path: the colonnades, the shops, the church of St. Aquilina. By Saturday night, the complex of palace buildings was effectively isolated by the rioters. Justinian was being besieged, and his paranoia was understandably growing. Once night fell, he gave the order for all the senators in the palace to leave and return to their homes. Before they left, Hypatius and Pompeius swore to Justinian that they were loyal to him and had had nothing to do with the rebellion. After years of faithful service to the new regime, Justinian probably believed them. On Sunday morning, it was time to gamble. Justinian may well have been present on that amazing day when Anastasius took off his diadem
Silly.
and offered to resign in the Hippodrome. He saw the way the crowd's anger subsided in the realization of what they might lose. While not going quite that far, he attempted his own theatrical stunt by appearing before the crowds in the Kathisma and swearing on a copy of the Gospel, offering a general amnesty for any crimes committed in the last week, and promising to listen to the demands of his people. But what had worked for Anastasius did little for Justinian. No one believed him. A few cheers were soon drowned out with boos and catcalls.
Fuck this guy.
Some smart aleck asked whether the oath Justinian was swearing was worth the same as the one he'd given Vitalian. Less witty cries of liar went up amongst the general uproar, and then some cries of long live Hypatius. News that Anastasius's nephews had left the palace had now filtered out. The rebels rushed to Hypatius's home and dragged him to the Forum of Constantine, crowning him with a gold chain. His wife was along, objecting all the way, commenting that the chain was more noose than crown. Hypatius probably felt the same way, but now met with other senators who advised him to occupy one of the minor palaces and wait Justinian out. The other option was to just storm the palace and kill all those inside.
Let's
But
get it.
fears of the casualties that would ensue led to some debate. The Green Blues were impatient, and Hypatius himself favoured a swift end to the affair. In the end, a mob raised Hypatius up on their shoulders, bore him to the Hippodrome, and lifted him into the Kathisma, much to the delight of the crowd, who loudly hailed him emperor and continued to yell abuse at Justinian and Theodora.
You suck, you guys.
The excubators, sensing the end of the conflict was at hand, entered the box to protect Hypatius from attack from the palace entrance. On hearing this, Justinian decided it was time to leave. The consensus amongst his advisers was to make for Heraclea on the European coast nearby in Thrace. The men seemed broadly in agreement until the Empress Theodora intervened. Although the speech which comes down to us is undoubtedly fictitious, the sentiment seems entirely plausible. The former prostitute was determined not to lose the status she had so amazingly won for herself. She pointed out how
She was literally a
intolerable
former
exile
prostitute, by
would
the way.
be
That
for
wasn't just a
those who
dig.
once ruled the empire, and questioned if death was not preferable to going on the run. She closed with the line that the imperial purple would make the finest burial shroud.
Damn bitch. All right.
Either convinced by her argument or shamed by the boldness of a woman, Justinian and his men remained. Turning to the two options available to him, Justinian gathered a large bag of cash and handed it to a trusted Armenian eunuch named Narses, and told him to seek out the leaders of the Blues. Narses was instructed to remind them that Anastasius had always favoured the Greens, and so surely Hypatius would too. What would stop their new emperor from leaving the Blues out in the cold in his new regime? Justinian clearly trusted Narses a lot. Remember that Justin only came to power because he had been handed a bag of bribes and used them to his advantage on the last occasion that there had been a crisis of succession.
Girl boss.
Narses, though, was worthy of the emperor's trust, and the seemingly frail man slipped unnoticed from the palace and located the leaders of the Blues. He seems to have been successful, as a number of Blues appear to have abandoned the rebellion around this time. The other option, the military one, was now exercised too. Justinian ordered Belisarius to attack the crowds while they were gathered in the Hippodrome. Belisarius initially wanted to use the passageway to the Kathisma and simply snatch Hypatius away. However, the executors were unmoved, and so he had to make his way to the Hippodrome floor, climbing through rubble and smouldering ruins.
How embarrassing.
There again he was blocked. Entering through the west side, Belisarius could see that if he tried to force his way up the spiral staircase which led to the imperial box, his men would have to turn their backs on the crowd, who would surely fall on them. So instead he gave the order to attack. From the other side of the Hippodrome, Mundus led his men in through the Dead Gate,
Mundus, isn't that a
so
Final
called
Fantasy
because it was
guy?
the place where fallen charioteers were
Or-
taken.
Demon
The Hippodrome
Devil May
was
Cry?
117 meters wide by 500 meters long, but plenty of that space was taken up by the seating. The crowd, which numbered somewhere between 30 and 50,000, were mostly on the arena floor. In close ranks, 500 armed men could make a line 4 or 5 deep across the width of that floor. Once inside, they began to attack indiscriminately. It was a massacre, as the crowd was caught between two sets of armed killers marching slowly toward them. The majority of people were unarmed. Some of the Greens were said to be wearing armor, but in the press of panicking and hysterical rioters, there was little they could do, as the disciplined soldiers methodically cut them down.
Damn bitch.
Procopius reports that 30,000 lay dead at the end of the day.
30,000.
Other sources say more, though it's not clear whether the
God,
estimates
yeah,
are
that AI
based
voice
on
is
the
shit,
merely
man.
wounded or the actual dead.
They just keep bringing out
Either
the
way,
worst public
The
releases
casualties
ever.
were enormous.
Each year.
The stench was terrible.
Oh.
The ground covered in gore.
Stinky.
The city silent. With a population of around 500,000 people, everyone in Constantinople was touched by the toll.
Holy shit.
Hypatius and Pompeius were brought before the emperor. Justinian probably knew that they were innocent of any real crime,
He wiped out a
but at the
sixth
prompting of
or a
Theodora
third of the
and
population,
common
whatever, I
sense,
can't do fractions.
he couldn't allow them to live, in case they became rallying points for another rebellion.
Had him strangled, had him strangled!
They were executed the next day,
Oh.
and their bodies thrown into the sea. Their families were left unharmed, but their estates were confiscated. 18 other senators were similarly disinherited and banished for their part in what had happened. Some years later, when feeling secure on the throne, Justinian actually restored some of the property to those families. But for now they were gone, and Justinian's position was much strengthened. Effective opposition to his regime was silenced. Over the next few years, Justinian's projects would gather pace in such a way that he may have viewed the Nika Revolt, as it would become known, as confirmation of his destiny.
Okay.
The centre of Constantinople was, of course, in ruins. One eyewitness says that the city was uninhabitable because of dust, smoke, and stench of materials being reduced to ashes, striking pathetic dread in those who beheld it. Justinian looked at the charred
Bad
ruins of the
editing and not
city in a
AI,
different
yeah.
light. The great builder had
Squeenix,
just been
yeah.
handed the chance to
That might
remodel
be
the capital of his
Steph
empire
Sterling
to his own
ism.
specifications. An ironic consequence of the revolt was to actually give Justinian the opportunity to cement his legacy in stone for future generations to see. The city prefect would be in charge of reconstructing houses and minor buildings, but for the most important structures that had fallen, Justinian would direct the architects personally and reimagine the city on a
Boom,
grander
baseball
scale, one fitting of the greatness of the Roman Empire. The Christian Roman Empire, of course.
Of course.
Only 40 days after it had fallen,
We don't want any of those
workmen were preparing the
pagans.
ground for a new Hagia Sophia, one Justinian had clearly already been dreaming of. As I said at the start of the podcast, the Nika Revolt marks a turning point in the history of Byzantium.
Weenus.
Contemporaries like Procopius bemoaned that Justinian
Good
had
old Steph
destroyed the
Sterling.
last vestiges of
They're
Romanness
so
from the
real.
empire, ushering in an Eastern-style autocracy. While it's certainly true that the Demes would never again unite in rebellion, it's highly debatable if they represented anything to do with the kind of republican virtues that Procopius and his ilk liked to celebrate. Where Procopius may be onto something, though, is the way in which senatorial influence and privilege had begun to disappear. During the last century, the emperors had been so concerned with gaining the upper hand over Goths and Isaurians that senators had been able to enjoy rather loose reins of government. Between the new taxes, tightening restrictions, and the attack on pagan learning, it's clear why the old Greco-Roman aristocracy would feel that Nika represented the end of an era. For the rest of his days, Justinian's power went unchallenged by the elite, and he was free to remake the empire without worrying about treading on their toes. Of course, the revolt was a horrible, scarring incident. Contemporary historians were very critical of Justinian for the slaughter he ordered. Many people were heartbroken, widowed, or destitute. The emperor, too, was left with a permanent reminder that those who kissed his robes might one day stick a knife through them. Within a year, John the Cappadocian
I appreciate
and
he didn't
Tribonian
put a
were both
butt
back
in
at their
there.
posts. However, Justinian reined in John's tax regime and kept an eye on Tribonian's legislation. He had been given a warning about the excesses of his regime and was not likely to forget how close he came to losing everything. For Mundus, Narses, and Belisarius, though, promotion awaited. They had all been there when the emperor needed them, and he would reward them with important duties. In 2 weeks' time, Belisarius will be reassigned. If the Roman Empire was to be restored, then its lost western provinces must be retaken. And what better place to start than with Africa, where those Aryan Vandals were about to feel the wrath of the Orthodox Emperor.
That's the lamest. Like, a nerd is like,
Yeah, prepare to feel the wrath of the Orthodox Emperor.
ah, my bones. Ah, my bones. Ah, my bones. Every single finger needs to be snapped. You gotta add AI to the pistons to make them better. Behind the Bastards had a really good podcast about, or a pair episodes about, like the cult of AI and just the weird kind of mindset that's trying to drive this shit forward. It's wild. I won't go over it here because it's a little depressing, but all right. I think I might call that done. So cute. It's wild. It's basically like, I don't know. I don't know what it basically is. It's just fucking wild. I'm sure there's some like medical diagnoses that can be improved with AI. I mean, a lot of bad shit can happen if like doctors rely on it too hard. But, you know, if you're like looking through a big petri dish of cancer cells or whatever cells, maybe you could write something that'll identify shit quicker, but it's so much making its own problems in terms of like cybersecurity even and all this other shit. Ugh. And in terms of like the entertainment industry, it's fucking not good. Could AI do this? Make a cute comic of a puppy girl? I don't think so. I mean, it could try. Literally, yeah. Yeah. What do you mean, Miss Ebola? Listen, we have this new guy called AI Sam, and you just put a scalpel in one of his little calipers here, and he'll... Ah! So, anybody want to do a Butlerian jihad? Anybody? A little holy war against the robots? Anybody? What are we feeling? Badlands Cola. Is that like Badlands Chugs? Is it just Badlands Chugs podcast? I would listen to it. Yeah, AI is just a fucking buzzword. It's so bad. Holy shit. Get those piggins in there. Pigeons stay winning. Oh. My spine. Okay. Let's get another episode up, and we will start on the 2nd. And actually, let me just check my Google form here. You know, we only have 2 commissions today, and that's okay. I will drop the link to the form in chat in case anybody wants one, but if we only have 2, that's all right, because that just means I can hand you off to Gianni that much sooner. Let's see. Itchy. Or I'll play video games for an hour or something like that. I don't know. There is a device called the Da Vinci surgical robot. Yeah, I think I've seen those, right? That's so cool. It's got like the whole... Oh, that goes so hard. Oh, yeah. Oh, that's so sick. Just fucking get in there. I guess it's because fingers are too fat and too like shaky to really open somebody up. For returning or non-returning viewers, Miss Ebola is like literally a cardiac surgeon. She can take your heart out of your chest while still beating. She's basically an Aztec priestess. Those are so cool. Okay, I would like to introduce to you, like, the peak of male design, by the way. I haven't picked out a reference picture for him. Give me a second. let me get a podcast going and let me get a good. I want one about the Black Plague. Or, I guess it wasn't really the Black Plague. The Black Plague is 1500s, 1400s. The Plague of Justinian.
Let's see. This is really important. We gotta have the right. We gotta have the right episodes. We gotta make sure we're entertained while we work.
Me when I can't find the right YouTube video to eat my dinner to. So true. I am not impressed with how Patreon is loading. I'm trying to see if they have any episodes on it. Plague. Ooh, episode 29, The Nightmare Decade. Oh, here we go. A cheerful
Hello,
episode
everyone,
for us.
and welcome to the History of Byzantium, Episode 27, The Walking Dead. For those of you who don't check how long an episode is before you begin listening, I feel honor bound to tell you that for this installment I've thrown aside the History of Rome target of half an hour and let things run a little longer. One day, around October 541, at the port city of Pelusium, a sailor developed a headache. Soon after, he added pains in his leg and back and a fever to his list of symptoms.
If this episode freaks anybody else out, by the way, let me know and we don't have to listen to it. It's
the
a
first man
exciting
had a painful
episode.
swelling in his groin, while one of his friends became confused, his speech slurred, his eyes bloodshot. By the end of the week, some of them had blackened skin, while others were bedridden and delirious. 2 weeks after the headache first appeared, everyone on that ship was dead. And now it was the shocked dock workers who were complaining of headaches and fever. Then the shop owners they traded with became ill. Then their families. Soon the whole of Pelusium was in turmoil as person after person
What is the
became
context
infected
behind the stock image?
and died.
It's part of a collection of stock images I bought a year or two ago, and they continue to pay off every single day I work. I love this collection. I can't remember the name of the folks who do it, but me and this one hot Russian model have completed a lot of works together. We're actually kind of like besties.
Disease was a common feature of life in the ancient world. As sad as death was, it was something everyone had experienced and everyone expected. Even outbreaks of serious illness that crippled whole towns were not unheard of, but they usually didn't last long. Pelusium is in Egypt, near to the modern Suez Canal, so even when news of a horrifying death toll reached neighbouring Alexandria, it's unlikely that anyone was overly concerned. But
Yes,
once the docks of the
absolutely.
second city of the empire were
That's a fun way
overrun with
to
dead
start
sailors,
drawing.
people began to realize that this disease was something new.
This one's even more yucky.
The distinctive feature of the outbreak were the bubones, buboes in English, large dark swellings which would appear around the groin or armpit and which no one seems to have seen before or have any record of. More alarming even than these unsightly growths was the speed at which the disease spread and killed. For 4 months of the Egyptian winter, the disease just kept on
giving
killing
him a
in
dump truck.
Alexandria. Corpses lay rotting on corners, in courtyards, and in churches, with no one to bury them. The streets became putrid, with piles of the dead, so thick with flies, so slippery underfoot, with blood and melted flesh that it was impossible
Melted
to clear them.
flesh.
The people were panicking. Those who were ill were staggering around the streets, collapsing in public, their mouths wide open, their hands stretched out upward. Those who were
I will no
able
longer say
fled,
skill issue. This
while
sounds
those who
like it
remained
sucks.
lived in constant
Hot
fear
take.
that they would be next. To add to the horror came humiliation. Alexandria was
Oh, wait,
home to
he's
the
got
Roman
digit
world's
grade.
finest medical schools. The best physicians in the city were helpless in the face of the disease. They had no clue what was causing the illness, or how to treat it. Even more frustratingly, they couldn't even predict the severity of the disease. Those with a mild fever
Audiobooks,
were told to
podcasts
get on
this
with their
time.
work,
This is History of
only
Byzantium.
to die suddenly the following day. While those who a doctor confidently pronounced were
Also,
not
hello.
long for this world would struggle on for weeks before recovering. Egypt was alone during this time. As you know, ships didn't regularly sail during winter, and although a few apocalyptic warnings would have filtered along land routes, it's unlikely that anyone further north knew what had really happened. By spring 542, the worst ravages of the plague were over, and the Egyptians had to try and return to normal life. For the majority of them, that meant gathering grain, loading it onto ships, and sending it to the rest of the empire. Little did they know that they were about to export disease and death along with their food.
And a bunch of cute little rats.
So by March and April 542, the plague began to spread across the empire. By
I
boat,
coughed. Do you
the
think it's the
disease
plague?
first appeared in Gaza, then the rubble of Antioch, and finally Constantinople. Some ships never arrived, the whole crew dying on board, leaving the boat to meander across the sea. Inland, the caravan routes took it to Jerusalem and Damascus,
Stop blaming
to
the
Myra
rats. It's
and
the
Sicyon in
fleas.
Anatolia. Nowhere
True.
seemed safe. When the buboes appeared, it was already too late to run.
I will handle the plague rats.
In the capital, Procopius was once more
They're
fortunate,
just another set of victims.
or in this case perhaps not, to be an eyewitness to history unfolding. He gives us the best account of the symptoms of the disease. Victims were first gripped by a sudden fever. In fact, the colour of the skin, nor create as high a temperature as a bout illness would normally generate. Doctors and friends were initially unconcerned by this apparently languid fever. But sometime later that day, or the next, but definitely within a week, bubonic swelling appeared, sometimes growing as large as melons and causing great discomfort. As well as the groin or the armpit, the swelling would occasionally appear
They were
in
using
the
fleas as
thighs
bioweapons.
or behind the ears. Up to this point, everyone seemed to suffer similarly, but once the buboes arrived, different paths would emerge. Some would enter a coma-like state, sleeping for long periods and occasionally forgetting who the people were around them, while others couldn't sleep and began to hallucinate or seem delirious, crying out in terror or running into the streets. Those tending to the sick were exhausted, and of course those who had no one to look after them passed away. For a third group, the bubonic swelling became mortified, and the victim died in agony. Some lost all sense of feeling before the end. If you broke out in black pustules, you wouldn't survive the day. If you vomited blood, you wouldn't survive the day. In the words of author William Rosen, for 4 months,
You just have to keep all the blood
Constantinople
inside.
was a window onto hell. As usual, the visitation began at the docks, before working its way into every quarter of the city. The poor died first, then the blues and greens, forced to put aside their differences to deal with their fallen comrades. then the artisans, tradesmen, and guild members, then the senators. Many in imperial service died. Tribonian disappears from the historical record at this point, and it's tempting to assume he was one of its victims. Death stalked the streets. Thousands were dying every day, and citizens were afraid to leave their homes without wearing a tag to identify themselves in case they never returned.
Let me just Google
Those in
that.
pain or suffering hallucinations
Oh.
would throw themselves off buildings to escape
I don't
their
like
torment.
it. I'm glad you're okay.
One particularly
That sounds
foul-smelling
horrible.
home was avoided by passers-by until someone went in and found 20 rotting corpses inside. A city the size of Constantinople was used to around 30 people dying every day. Within a couple of weeks, the regular burial sites were overloaded with the dead. Some bodies were tossed into the sea, but the soup of decomposing flesh that this created was no solution. Christians demanded a
forbidden
proper
soup.
burial anyway. Justinian ordered massive pits to be dug across the Golden Horn in the suburb of Sikai. However, as the nightmare summer dragged on, even this became full, with the unfortunate gravediggers having to pack bodies in tightly and push down on them to make room for more. The men eventually turned to the guard towers along the walls surrounding Sikai and began piling bodies in them.
All
When
they
the
had to
wind
do was
blew
wash their
south,
hands.
The stench covered the whole city. The streets were now empty. No business of any kind was undertaken. The butcher's shops, the markets, the bakeries all ceased to be used. Famine now followed pestilence, and it was considered great fortune to have enough bread to feed what remained of your family. An earthquake hit in August, which only intensified
Okay, maybe I'm
the
starting to
feeling
understand
that these
God-fearing.
were the end times. All court functions ceased, and no one was seen in official dress, particularly once the disease decided to prove its egalitarian nature once and for all, and infected Justinian.
Comrade
one of the
Basilian
lucky ones.
Pestins.
Left in a coma-like state for weeks,
Or,
he wasn't
Justinian
short of
Pestins.
attendants to care for him. Theodora was left in effective control of the government, a situation we will deal with next week. By August, the plague had died down to a manageable level. Trusting Procopius's estimates of the dead is difficult, but many scholars do assume that at least 200,000 people, if not more, died during that outbreak. This, in a city that had stood 500,000 strong.
Oh, don't worry. Germ theory doesn't come around until
Out in the
1800s.
provinces, the toll varied from
We
place
got a
to
lot
place.
more decades of mistakes
One
coming.
of our sources is a Syrian scholar called Evagrius, whose personal story is deeply tragic. Although he survived the plague, he would lose his wife, his daughter, his grandson, other relatives, and many servants as the plague returned in later waves. He confirms similar symptoms that Procopius describes, adding sore throats and diarrhea for good measure, and pointing out that even those who caught the plague and survived would often have lisps or muscular tremors for the rest of their days. More information comes from a Monophysite clergyman who we know as John of Ephesus. He had to journey to Constantinople during this time and describes empty villages and imperial staging
Illusionist, you can
posts
send it to me
littered
on
with
Twitter. I can
corpses.
share it with the class if you like.
As harvest time approached, he saw empty fields with grain white and erect, but no
Oh.
one to reap them, while flocks of sheep
Excellent.
and other animals were living wild off the land. He also hears stories of more personal tragedies, of weddings abandoned on the day itself, when either bride or groom had died.
Oh my god, cute.
In addition to the horror and the grief,
No, wait.
there also came a psychological and spiritual torment. Many victims claimed they had seen a ghostly apparition touch them
Yeah.
just before they fell ill. While out on the coast,
So where would everyone be stationed
In a medieval army. Fucking dead. The Eternal Optimist. Yeah. Magnificent. Here, let me send a link to that too. everybody should follow Bemused Illusionist. That's just my opinion, though. 1500s, maybe? Yeah. 1800s where it was accepted. God. Miasma was the big thing. Man, Miasma's so close. They almost got it with that. And I do kind of wonder, like, if that helped at all. I mean, was it better than nothing? Surely it was better than nothing.
As one port town after another succumbed to the disease, men began to describe demonic visions out on the waves. Boats with headless oarsmen, glowing like fire, moving around the Mediterranean to deliver God's vengeance.
Yeah.
During the height of the plague, a story comes to us from a city on the edge of Palestine, where apparently some demons, in the form of angels, appeared to the terrified inhabitants, telling them they would only be spared if they worshipped a bronze idol. It's fair to say that for most people in the empire, this apocalyptic event was assumed to be the work of God. When John saw the bodies being squeezed into the pits at Sikai, he calls forth the image of the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God from the book of Jeremiah, and assumes that as with the flood, good Christians should be building their metaphorical arks in order to survive. Temporarily, this may have worked, as, according to Procopius, local brigands and ne'er-do-wells changed the habits of a lifetime for fear of being struck down, visiting church regularly, and being kind to those around them, until the disease passed, when they returned to their old ways. By March
Fallen
543,
Ace's goon.
Justinian was back on his feet, issuing a law which declared that the epidemic was over, and calling it God's education. As William Rosen points out, we are very lucky to have Procopius, whose training and preference was for the Hellenistic historical approach to writing, which means that he notes events as he saw them, rather than putting them through a starkly Christian lens. If the plague was God's wrath, then it seemed that God was angry at everyone. The disease took no account of gender, race, age, class, location, or even season. Evagrius notes with frustration how some were spared even when they tried to contract the disease to end their misery.
Oh, God.
Through these sources, we also hear that cattle, dogs, mice, even snakes were not immune to the plague. Why, even rats,
Snakes.
swollen with buboes, were to be seen infected and dying.
See, there were victims too, the poor little ratties.
The plague was a devastating blow to the Byzantine Empire, just as it was to all the nations whom it touched. Estimates of the total number of dead are hard to come by, but it's assumed that most towns, cities, or army camps that became infected would lose a third of their people. The plague was not over either. Every year it would break out in a new location. In 543 it reached Africa, Italy, Illyricum, Gaul, and the border with Persia. Another historian comments that the world seemed returned to its primordial silence, for no voices rose in the fields, no whistling was heard of shepherds. The following year it made its way to Spain, Britain, and Ireland, with reports coming in from places as far afield as Scandinavia
Yeah.
and the Yemen.
I almost want to keep it. I'm going to
Whether
keep
it
something
was an
similar
island
because, like,
or
look
a
at them.
hilltop community, the plague seemed to find those places which it hadn't already struck. And it would return to the same cities a few decades later and hit them again. Constantinople would suffer a recurrence in 558, 573, and 599. The same goes for Antioch, Amida, Nisbis, Rome, Thessalonica,
I thought he was
and
going to
so
say
on,
Nesbit.
for 2 centuries, until 747, when the last recorded outbreak took place in Naples. To put it another way, by the year 600, the Mediterranean population was probably only 60% of what it had been in 500. The demographic growth which had helped the Byzantines see off the Germans and the Isaurians, that had filled the treasury of Anastasius, and allowed for the reconquests under Justinian were wiped out in a year or two. The chance for the Roman Empire to reform itself in anything like its former strength was now gone. The Byzantine world did not collapse, though. Despite the death and the accompanying dislocation, life would go on. Next week, we will explore the political fallout in detail, but for the rest of this episode, I want to try and answer the question of what on earth happened here. I should start by acknowledging that there is no academic consensus on what the plague was. Its origins, its makeup, or even if all those who reportedly died of plague from 540 to 740 were suffering from the same disease. Even with DNA evidence from 6th century skeletons confirming the mainstream theory, we still lack sufficient proof to be certain. We are fairly confident, though, that the bacteria responsible for the plague goes by the name of Yersinia pestis. Bacteria have been living on the earth for millions upon millions of years. They were here well before we were, and have had a long time to adapt to the new environments that the arrival of mammals provided.
Mammal
Bacteria
flesh.
spend their days adapting and reproducing.
They spend their
Their
days.
raison d'etre. They have the ability to rewrite their genetic code by borrowing, copying, or adapting themselves to find a better means of surviving, spreading, and multiplying. For Yersinia, its preferred home for a long time was the digestive system of the rodent, marmots, squirrels, and rats. The process was slow but steady, as Yersinia passed out of one animal through its waste and then managed to find a new host. However, there's an inefficiency to that process that I'm sure you can imagine, and Yersinia dreamt of a better way. The answer came
Something about
with the
not
flea,
referring to
the
evolutionary
tiny blood-sucking insect,
biology as
many
sentient.
of whom live on the backs of rodents. Although their aim is to extract blood, the process
He's a
is
historian,
something of
not
a
a
two-way
biologist, I'll forgive
street. Here, then, came Yersinia's chance. Who knows how many times over how many years it took for Yersinia to adapt to living temporarily in a
Germa
flea's
caused the
gut,
plague. I knew it.
a quite different environment to that of a mammal, before working out a way of being pumped back into another animal's bloodstream. The process was utterly ingenious. Once absorbed by the flea, Yersinia would make a protein which would turn off the flea's natural defenses and
My
prevent
plague
itself
is
from
an honor
adhering
student.
to the flea's stomach.
It's a genius.
It would then make a sort of glue out of blood. This biofilm would clump together, sealing off the flea's stomach from the blood it was taking in. The flea, realizing it wasn't getting fed, would now bite frantically at anything it could, desperate to gather more life-giving blood. As it sucked
Me and my
voraciously
Bloodborne
at
playthrough.
its new target, the blood already in its foregut would be forced out, infecting the unfortunate mammal with Yersinia pestis. This ultra-cunning transportation system gave Yersinia exactly what it was looking for. Fleas, you see, are themselves very adaptive to their rodent hosts. Some species of flea have learnt to give birth at the same time as their carriers do, so that their children can move to new homes. The fleas can also, of course, jump from one rodent to another, latch on, and begin feeding. So now Yersinia could spread itself more efficiently around a group of mammals, infecting, replicating, and adapting. But it was at this point that Yersinia pestis got greedy. This is also the moment when we introduce the particular species responsible for the plague. The flea was Xenopsilla chiopsis, the oriental rat flea. Its host was Rattus rattus.
Rattus,
the
rattus!
black rat. The black rat arrived in Europe during the time of the
Holy
Roman
shit.
Empire, and its
I fucking love
population
Rattus
density
rattus.
is what attracted it to Yersinia pestis. Rats live in large groups, falling over one another to breed and get access to food. And
They have
female
to have
rats
sexo.
deliver litters of up to 20 pups 5 to 7 times a year. Yersinia was staring at a gold mine of fresh bloodstreams to replicate within, and was not satisfied even with the fleas
Me
transporting them
looking at the
around.
blood.
You see, Xenopsilla chiopsis has little reason to leave the rat it's living on. Fleas have short lives, and so several generations of flea can live happily on the back of one rat.
Two rats having sex.
Despite its amazing adaptability, Yersinia could not effectively survive in every bloodstream. Some rats had hardy immune systems, and if they detected
Some rats
and
were
killed
Chad gym
Yersinia,
rats.
they would remember it, develop an immunity, and possibly pass it on to their offspring. Yersinia wanted a way to force the fleas to find new rats who had no immunity. The solution to this problem was quite simple. Yersinia would just kill the rat.
Oh.
Again, over untold years or centuries of adapting,
Bruxing
Yersinia
stops.
developed the necessary toxins and proteins that could attack the rat's immune system and kill it.
Hold up, did he say protein?
The flea would be forced to jump to a new host and spread Yersinia far and wide amongst the colony of rats. The balance has to be right, of course. Yersinia needs time to reproduce before the rat begins to die. So the bacteria learnt to keep its poisons less poisonous at mammal body temperature. The rat could therefore live with the disease for a week without showing any symptoms until the bacteria reproduced sufficiently to raise body temperature, and then the lights would go out. Now, this new deadly strain of Yersinia presented a major problem. What if it was too successful and killed all the rats? In its search for the most efficient reproduction method, Yersinia was reaching the point
Yersinia
where it might have
fucked up.
undermined itself.
This stupid fucking
Thousands of
plague.
fleas living on
Should've gone to
hundreds of
grad
rats,
school.
injecting hundreds of thousands of bacterial cells, is for the most part a stable ecosystem. Because, as you remember, a good number of rats will be immune to Yersinia, either through a
Yeah, I think
strong
I always
immune
assumed it
system
was a virus
or
until,
acquired immunity after
I don't know,
infection. The problem for Yersinia's survival
I guess
only
that's why it's less
arises
of a problem
when there
now?
aren't enough
Although
of
it does
these
still
resistant
exist,
rats
unfortunately.
in a particular group. For any rat colony, there will be a tipping point.
Nightmare course of antibiotics.
If for some reason 80% of one group of rats became infected and die, then suddenly you've got a lot of manically hungry fleas looking for something to feed on.
Hungry.
Naturally, they look for the nearest warm-blooded mammal to bite. And who do rats normally live next to?
Frogs.
Humans.
Oh,
Of course, horses, dogs, camels, whatever will get bitten too, but we are rats' constant companions. This is because rats are so omnivorous that they feast on human garbage. They'll eat any sort of vegetable matter, from seeds, nuts, leaves and fruit, to less obvious fare, like paper, soap, beeswax, along with animal food and all sorts of items that humans gladly
Plague
pile
sucks.
up day after day.
what a prick! I don't blame
So
him
if the
for
rat
like
population
giving
crashes
it human
and
characteristics.
fleas feast on the neighbouring humans instead,
What an asshole!
then Yersinia pestis will enter the human bloodstream. All the mechanisms and adaptations made for the rat's body now go out the window. The human body is, of course, much larger, and Yersinia had no instructions to find a balance with this new system. It only cared about the rat. So
Me.
when Yersinia arrived in Pelusium, it began to attack and destroy its strange new environment. The outer proteins of Yersinia pestis are designed to prevent the body from destroying it, in part by blocking the signals which would alert the body to attack,
Oh.
and in part by blocking the phagocytes.
Oh, the what? You can't say that.
Normally
Oh.
absorb such an intruder. Once in, Yersinia would begin replicating as fast as it could,
Two
which
giant
would
gay
often leave
bouncers
the area of the flea
standing
bite
outside
to
of your
turn
body.
necrotic,
The gay
or leave
sounds.
the tissue withered.
Oh my god. I am getting an image. Yeah, two huge gay bouncers. Shit, they slipped by them. No.
At this point, the body does recognize that something is wrong and conveys
Maybe
the
that's the
bacteria
one,
to the
the
lymphatic
shining
system,
thread. It's
where our
everybody who
blood
got killed by the
circulates
plague was
and
homophobic.
diseases are normally attacked. However, this is where Yersinia wants to be taken. It now has access to the whole body and continues to spread and replicate.
I have not read Cells at Work.
Our immune system tries to drag the disease to one of the regional lymph nodes, garrisons of
Is that
white
what
blood
Osmosis
cells,
Jones
where
was
most
based off of?
diseases are slowly absorbed. The battle is fierce, and the node becomes engorged with blood and cellular debris, which create the grossly swollen buboes.
The crunchers.
As you may have figured out by now, the lymph nodes can be found in the groin, the armpit, and other areas where the swelling appeared. The reason swelling of the groin was most common is simple. The tiny fleas, looking for somewhere to bite, would first come upon the legs,
They going
and so the
balls
infection
first.
would be drained toward the nearest lymph node around the crotch. The bubonic edemas would press on the nerve endings of its victims, causing tremendous pain. Now, as the body struggles to replace deoxygenated blood with oxygenated, the muscles surrounding the human voice box become more acidic, which was the cause of much temporary or permanent speech problems for those who survived.
Wow. All right.
We've now reached the stage where the divergences which Procopius observed begin. For those who were destined to survive, their battle would now rage, leaving them exhausted and sleepy until their body won, and often the swollen bubo would explode in a shower of pus.
Ugh.
For others, the bubonic edema might turn septic, and like a snake shedding its skin, the tissue would collapse, often causing shock and death. As the body heats up from battle, Yersinia begins to release its toxins. Two of its most deadly weapons interfere with the body's ability to clot blood and form platelets. This attack on the blood leads to the gangrene, or blackened extremities, chiefly toes and fingers, which 700 years later, in Yersinia's most famous appearance on the world stage, would lead to the nickname, the Black Death. If they spread further across the body, giving the appearance of lentil-like blisters, as Procopius identified, then death would follow swiftly. If the plague became septicemic, then victims would die, vomiting
interesting.
blood from internal
Cells
hemorrhages.
at Work.
Another of Yersinia's deadly toxins are a collection of fatty acids known as lipid A. Once embedded, they cause overproduction of an enzyme which releases tumor necrosis factor, which can kill cells. Again, the result is shock, sometimes fatal. The most fatal results, though, come from the third option. If Yersinia reached the highway into the
I would
lungs,
simply choose none of
then
these.
the victim would
I
start to
abstain.
produce sputum. When the sputum accumulates blood, the infection moves from being bubonic to pneumonic. This meant that a victim's saliva drops were infectious and could contaminate someone being talked to within a 2-meter range. Mortality rates for pneumonic plague are 100%. Although bubonic plague is what killed most people, with a guess being that 40% of those infected would die, pneumonic plague leads to guaranteed fatality.
Damn.
Like the zombie fiction which gives this episode its title, victims of the plague were
one of
unknowingly
those books, huh?
breathing a death sentence onto the loved ones who gathered around them. The tiny particles would be absorbed slowly by the unwitting victim, who might then spend the best part of a month thinking themselves immune, before suddenly Yersinia had replicated enough to attack. So that's what was going on in the body. Within the Byzantine Empire and beyond, I assume you can now build up a picture of how the disease spread. The diet of Rattus rattus requires a good deal of water. So the rats were big fans of anywhere that was damp and had lots of food. The Nile Valley, Pelusium, and Alexandria were all ideal homes for the rat. Constantinople, Antioch, and any other major city with a good source of water would do just as well. Many diseases might flare up dramatically in one city, but having killed off so many potential hosts, they would burn themselves out. And given the ancient world's slow travelling speed, most diseases would never make it all the way to a neighbouring province. This is why the plague attacking the Byzantine Empire is what turned the outbreak into a pandemic. Once Yersinia had killed off all the susceptible Egyptians it could
30 to
find,
60.
it may well have died out before the very slow caravan routes carried it out towards Libya or in
Slightly
the other
better
direction
odds.
towards Palestine. But fortunately for Yersinia, the Roman fleet was as good as any flea. The ships which set off from Alexandria in spring 542 carried rat, flea, and bacteria on ships filled to the brim with grain. A moving food hall to keep the
Grains.
rats alive and ready to spread their disease to the rats of the capital and its people. To add another gross thought to the legions conjured up already, the piles of dead bodies only provided a fresh source of food for the rats, who could then go on providing incubation for more plague. Once it reached new shores, Yersinia was able to spread slowly inland. One by one, towns would be visited, and Yersinia burst to life again, feasting on untested victims. Areas which avoided the plague in the early years would be found sometime later, and major cities like Constantinople and Antioch would be revisited multiple times, usually with 15 or 20-year gaps, so that a whole generation of children would have grown up with no acquired immunity to the disease. Round and round Yersinia would go, always capable of killing thousands, so long as new humans arrived who could be infected. Initially, Khusro was able to continue the war with Byzantium and retreat whenever the plague broke out in a nearby town. The Persians had limited trade between the empires to designated cities, like Nisbis. This kept the Sassanids away from the plague temporarily. But once it broke through, Mesopotamia, with the Tigris and Euphrates providing a wonderful home for rats, was devastated. One chronicler notes that all was famine, madness, and fury. The few areas to avoid large-scale destruction were those where rats would not want to live. Mainly mountainous highland or desert, wherever water and human garbage were hard to come by. We will explore this as we go on, but once more I'm sure you can see the significance of a plague which repeatedly decimated those living in cities, while the Arabs out in the desert, or the Bulgars of the steppe, were far less affected. In the next episode we will encounter such a scenario when the Moors of Africa return to the offensive. We've seen what the disease did. We've seen what it was doing on the inside. We've looked at how it spread. But what about the question, why now? Was this simply the moment when Yersinia had
They're
developed the
not
ability
weird
to
at
kill
all.
rats
They're
in
little
large numbers?
funky guys.
Or were other factors at play?
They do look like silly little guys.
The question is still open as to where exactly the deadly strain of Yersinia learnt its trade. In his excellent book,
I haven't seen any
Justinian's
virus
Flea,
OCs.
William Rosen puts together
Where are the
fairly
furries?
convincing conjecture about the origins of the plague. He points out that Xenopsilla chiopsis, the flea in question, prefers a dry, warm environment of around 20 to 25 degrees centigrade or 68 to 77 Fahrenheit.
In fake
As with
temperature
several other
units.
diseases, Rosen assumes that Yersinia originated around the mouth of the Nile, where many of the great African lakes are. This would have provided a comfortable home for rat, flea, and bacteria, but
Virus
kept it away
personas.
from any
Woman.
large-scale human settlements.
Really?
The question is, how did it get all
Get
the
your
way up
character
the Nile
sheets
to Egypt?
together. I
And
know you
then
have like
why jump to the
important
human
work like
population
saving
at that moment?
lives and you know
The
supporting
flea would
families
not
and
enjoy
shit.
the hotter temperatures
This is the
of
real
the desert environment of Egypt, which would have normally prevented any journey
I remember
that
Raven
far
having
north.
some biohazard.
What it would need to make such
aesthetic.
a jump would be several
based.
years of lower average temperatures. Like the sort that might occur if
Viruses that eat
the
other
sun gave
viruses?
forth its light without brightness, and it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse, for the beams it shed were not clear. Those were the words of Procopius, who says that between 536 and 538, summers were colder
Yeah, I think we have
because
a little bit of
something
time
was
for color.
blocking the sun.
A little bit of climate.
As I said in
problems?
episode 25, the two most likely explanations for a dust veil that could cover the whole Earth for 2 years would be a comet or meteor strike, or a huge volcanic explosion. Through dendrochronology, or the study of tree rings, we have evidence
That has a
suggesting that during
name?
this period a very
That's
real
so
drop in
cute.
temperature occurred. Could it have been enough to entice rats and fleas north toward Pelusium? Could the lower temperatures in fact encourage an explosion in the rat population, as the colonies of Egypt revelled in the cooler conditions? An explosion
Oh,
in
I know about
susceptible
prions.
rats, of course,
Absolute
would
terror.
be just what Yersinia was looking for.
That's
And
why
as
I'm
it
always
began
like,
a great cull
meat.
of the unsuspecting rodents, the
I'll still
flea
eat
would
it.
have been forced to look elsewhere for something to bite, and landed on the ankles of that sailor in the harbour of Pelusium.
That is why I actually am not
It's a good
cannibal.
theory, one that
I'm
it's
good.
very hard to prove, but which fits the facts sufficiently to offer us an educated guess about the origins of the plague. In David Keyes's book, Catastrophe, he argues for an explosion of the Sumatran volcano Krakatoa as the source of the dust veil.
Squidward.
He may well be right, but personally I'm attracted by the idea that a body from beyond the heavens struck the earth. That it was something extraterrestrial that ended up causing the plague, which would devastate the Roman Empire.
That's funny.
The empire would
I
never
love that.
recover the strength it had in Justinian's early years, and the eastern provinces, as you know, were destined to be conquered by the Arabs. But what if none of that was meant to be? What if the volcanic explosion had never happened, or the comet had missed the Earth? Would Justinian have crushed the remaining Goths, seen off the Persians, and gone on to conquer Spain, and leave a Roman Empire that would fight on for centuries more? It's fun to speculate. The final word on the plague is its name. The Black Death is such a catchy title, and is both more recent and more devastating,
It is a banger.
that it tends to hog the headlines when it comes to human pandemics. Our plague, unfairly or not, has conventionally been called the Justinianic Plague, or the Plague of Justinian. Named for the Roman emperor who strived so hard to be great, and was so horrifically surprised by this turn of events. The plague certainly defines the emperor more than any other man, and there's a real irony that for all his law books, and the cities and army detachments and the like which he named after himself, that it's Yersinia Pestis that will be known by his name to future generations. Next week, we go back to politics and see what happened while Theodora was left in charge of the empire and the wars in Italy, Africa, and Persia roll on. Despite the apocalypse unfolding around them, the Byzantines kept on fighting. Next week is also the episode I'm using to raise funds for the future of the history of Byzantium. It will be on sale at thehistoryofbyzantium.com for either $5
You
or
get
any
that
amount
bread.
above that you'd like to donate. And in case anyone is still in any doubt, 2 weeks after that, episode 29 will be back on the free feed as normal, and so will episode 31 and 30 and so on. I think I'll leave this episode there for now, though. Reading constantly about the plague for several weeks leaves you feeling kind of itchy. So I will release another podcast in the middle of next week to explain what you need to do to buy episode 28. I will make it as simple as possible,
Do a
and I'm
fucking
hugely
backflip.
grateful to all of you who've been so supportive.
Mm,
I'm okay.
horrifying. It's good. Fatal insomnia. I have. You know what? I'm not gonna look that up.
Hello,
I'm gonna do
everyone,
myself a favor.
and welcome to the History of Byzantium, episode 28,
You can explain it here if
After
you
the
want.
Apocalypse.
That won't be too gross.
First off, I should say thank you so much for supporting the history
I
of Byzantium.
really hope I'm just like hit by a
It
car.
means a
and
lot
it
to me that
killed
you enjoy the
instantly. I'm not gonna lie to you
podcast
guys.
and want to see it continue. So let's continue.
I hate cars, but you know.
As you know very well by now, during the summer of 542, bubonic plague reached Constantinople. The disease carried off somewhere between a third and half of the city's 500,000 inhabitants, causing mass grieving and mass dislocation.
One of those infected was the Emperor Justinian. He spent many weeks lying on what everyone assumed was his deathbed, and so effective control of the government fell to his powerful and opinionated wife, Theodora.
His hot wife, Theodora.
You may have noticed that in our story so far, Justinian never really left the capital. All imperial decision-making was done from inside the palace, and so naturally, messengers waited outside the doors until Theodora
literally could not
sent
touch
word
grass.
of what needed to be done.
Harder and harder to sleep.
With the slow speed of communication in the ancient world, anyone living, say, 50 miles from Constantinople
Magnificent.
would have understood
Yeah,
that
yeah, yeah,
any
these girls.
news
Yeah, yeah,
they
I remember the
heard
one on the right.
about
Yeah, yeah,
events
yeah,
in
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
capital were likely out of date
So you
by
die
the
of
time
exhaustion.
it reached them.
Okay, I don't know.
So when
Maybe that's not so
Belisarius
bad.
and Boozies got together on the Mesopotamian border and heard that
Scaling
Justinian had been
horrible
stricken by the
diseases.
plague, you
On
can't
how much
blame
you want to
them
get him.
for thinking that perhaps the emperor was dead already. Gathering the other senior officers together, the men agreed to not accept any successor that Theodora might appoint without their approval. Justinian and Theodora had no children together, and with Germanus out of favour, the fear was that Theodora might marry some puppet and then run the empire herself.
Mm-hmm.
The empress had schemed often against the leading men of the empire, interfering in Belisarius's personal life,
Good for her.
engineering the fall of John the Cappadocian,
Good for her.
and speaking ill of Germanus,
Good
the
for her.
emperor's cousin, whenever she could.
Good for her.
So there was little affection for the empress amongst the men who imagined that they might gain power should Justinian succumb to the plague. Of course he didn't, though. And while the emperor began to recover, Theodora furiously recalled both Boozies and Belisarius and tried to have them arrested for treason. Boozies ended up in a dungeon for 2 years before being released, while Belisarius, still being the empire's most popular general, was a little harder to treat so high-handedly. So she accused him of embezzling some of the Vandal and Gothic treasure, which he might well have done,
The balls on her.
and confiscated the majority of his wealth and his personal bodyguard. Later that year, when
Just
Justinian
by a
was fully
mutated
recovered,
protein, so it's a chance.
he
it's just
returned most
bad
of the
luck.
general's property and patched
The
up
one bad
relations
thing
a
about
little.
protein.
But before he was back on his feet, Theodora made another decision, which was to prove more fateful than she probably ever imagined. The Empress was a dedicated Monophysite, and as you may recall, the exiled Patriarch of Alexandria, Theodosius, was living in the palace as Theodora's guest. Justinian was happy to let the Monophysite leadership live under his roof so long as they remained private citizens and stayed out of his business. The
No, no.
long-running suppression of Monophysite practice was having one visibly positive effect
I think
from the Orthodox point of view.
Monophysites.
With no Monophysite bishops in the east, all the new clergy...
I think it was something about like how many natures of Christ there were or something. Yeah, Christ only had one nature, which was divine, rather than, I guess, the slightly more common belief that he had a divinity and then he was also human. Which is, of course, the rise of that great meme, was Jesus an ass or a tits man? So, Monophysites would be like, he was neither. But other people in Byzantium would be like, ooh, he was an X. Oh, whoops, wrong play button.
being appointed were loyal to the Council of Chalcedon. Justinian had had no success in persuading Monophysites and Chalcedonians to see eye to eye, but perhaps by denying the Monophysites any more clergy, their cause would slowly fade away. During 542, though, a message came from Harith, the Phylarch of the Ghassanid Arabs, who were Monophysite Christians. They respected the authority of the empire and asked for a bishop to be sent to live amongst them. Theodora, Perhaps feeling that because the Ghassanids were technically outside of the imperial realm, she could get away with it, and had 2 bishops consecrated and sent them to the Syrian and Mesopotamian borderlands. One of these men was a certain Jacob Baradius, a passionate believer in the Monophysite cause,
Jacob
who went
Baradius!
around the countryside not only preaching to the people, but consecrating new clergy himself. Jacob was both a charismatic speaker and politically savvy, often dressing as a beggar to avoid imperial officials. He encouraged the use of Syriac in his services to help his message reach the common people. And this, of course, only further
Gonna go
deepened the
eat.
sense that the Monophysite
Have a
church
good
was
sleep.
the local church of the people,
I will
while
probably
the
see you
Orthodox
next
Greek
week.
services
I'm going to do
were
more of these
imposed
streams then, I think.
by imperial outsiders. Long
if you
after
wake up,
his
Gianni's
death,
stream will
the
be on for a
Syrian
little
church
while.
would carry the nickname Jacobite due to the loyalty inspired by the bishop that Theodora appointed. If Justinian had realized
cool
the full
fucking name.
extent of what his wife's actions had unleashed, he would have been furious. At some point across the winter of 542-543, Justinian made a full recovery. It must have seemed to the emperor like he'd woken from a nightmare, only to discover that the real world was in even worse shape than his dreams could have conjured. Before the plague arrived, Justinian was already living beyond his means. He had commissioned building projects across the continent and had large field armies on multiple fronts in need of reinforcement. The sack of Antioch and the renewed war with Persia were already major distractions from his dreams of restoration. But now news came in that the armies scraped together to defend the frontier had been decimated by the plague. Historian Edward Lutwak points out that if an army detachment lost half its men, it wouldn't lose half its battle readiness, it would lose all of it. Men who had trained to fight together in formations, or had learnt specialist skills like shooting a bow while riding at speed, were gone, and could not be replaced overnight. Similarly, the whole process of governing, administering,
love a
and
fucking
taxing the
himbo.
empire would have been made
Look at this
far harder
jackass.
by
Oh,
the
I
sudden
love him.
death of thousands of officials. The machinery of state had ground to a halt, and Justinian desperately needed it back up and running yesterday. The emperor now had to manage a hugely expensive operation on a much reduced budget. Naturally, his means of restocking the treasury were deeply unpopular. One of the reasons that imperial tax collection was so much more efficient than that of neighboring states was the assessments which worked out how much productive land was available and therefore what the government should expect to take in. Imperial commitments were based on this assessment of the empire's wealth, and so as far as the state was concerned, they should receive the same amount of money, regardless of, say, how good the harvest had been. The empire's point of view, I suppose, is that in the good years, citizens should save to help cover for the bad years.
I'm sure that's what they were doing.
And the imperial tax collectors did not want to hear that poor Publius, the local farmer, had just died, or squandered all his money. To deal with each individual farm would take too much time, so local areas were affixed a tax burden. If Publius wasn't able to pay any tax, then his neighbours would have to cough up extra cash to meet their quota. This was, of course, an unpopular, if comparatively effective system. But with the plague just having swept through, the misery this situation caused is easy to imagine. Farmers in some areas were struggling to find help to gather in their own harvests, let alone worry about their deceased neighbour's tax bill. The wages for farm hands and the like had of course risen. With far fewer artisans and peasant farmers available, they were able to charge more for their services. In the capital, Justinian was appalled to discover the wage inflation going on around him. He passed a law declaring it illegal for a labourer to charge more than he would have done before the plague.
Oh, fuck off.
But it was to no avail. Real wages continued to soar.
While the people suffered miserably through these years, Justinian was forced to pursue the kind of austerity
his tattoo.
measures that we are quite used to hearing about today. He further slashed the imperial post, abandoned road maintenance, and further streamlined the civil service. The new Praetorian prefect, Peter Barismes, was not quite as ingenious as John the Cappadocian, but he pushed his tax collectors hard, and they extracted what they could from the people. Justinian's efforts to overthrow corrupt practices went out the window, though, and provincial governorships were once more put up for sale. The rich were squeezed hard wherever they could be, and it's easy to see under these circumstances why, in the secret history, Procopius dredges up the worst accusations his friends had ever thrown at the emperor. Could he really be a demon, in league with Satan, determined to destroy the empire from within? Of course, the major area of concern for Justinian's budget was the army. At least 50% of imperial expenditure was on pay and supplies, and to make ends meet, the emperor was forced to take the dangerous step of cutting back or delaying the pay of his army. First off, the border troops, the Limitanii, were struck from the payroll. They had been paid infrequently since the perpetual peace of 532, but now the emperor dropped any pretense that they would be receiving allowances from the government anymore. Most of these men had farms or businesses of their own, and would continue to band together to see off local raiders. But their days as an effective force that could beat back Persian scouts was over. The field armies had to be paid, but Justinian couldn't meet his deadlines, and so
I need to
began
do
to
one little shine on the
prioritize who would
barrel
get
of the,
paid and
gun.
when. This effectively kept the government solvent in the short term, but how many times do you think soldiers will accept late paychecks before they decide
I
to
need
do
flames on the side
something
of it too.
about it? In order to answer that question, we need to spend the rest of the episode
That does
out
not
on
look
the
good,
frontiers.
but it doesn't matter.
But before we go there, there is one other tendency of Justinian's
Hell yeah.
which was about to exacerbate the situation. Back in the early days of his reign, the emperor seemed to have an eye for power. The commanders he chose to
I think I'm
lead
going to
his
save that
armies
one a little
were
bit
not
early.
only good men,
Looking pretty good.
but loyal ones. By entrusting the African expedition to Belisarius' sole discretion, the emperor had won a victory that was easier and more complete than anyone expected.
We got another commission in. Let me check that Google form. We will be going for another hour. Although Gianni is streaming now, and if you wanted to hop over to his stream, no worries. Please do. Oh my God! It's a commission from Miss Ebola. Yes. Yes. Yes, 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 yes. Oh my God, banger. It shall be done, my queen. Alright, I think chat's gonna like where this is going. Yes. Actually, it doesn't have to be this big. Y'all are gonna know when Gianni and I start getting into Yakuza. Because it will happen. It is just a matter of time. Oh yeah, I love this character. Oh yeah. Oh yeah, oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Kiryu jump scare. Ooh, a sticker design. Excellent. Super big and super tough girl. Yakuza has made you cry. Like an actual baby at least a dozen times. That it does seem to be the consensus. I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to being emotionally devastated by these fucking wieners. Kind of looking forward to Mark Hamill. I think in the first one he was Majima, the crazy one. All right, you know what? If I was okay, let's just be smart about this one. Let's just use the reference here. I could do my whole line of action thing, but let's just get the perspective right on this. Of course, she's wearing a mask. You can't see her smiling. I'm concentrating very hard. We'll put the podcast back on shortly. Unless I can get, I was low-key considering, like, getting a Gianni stream in one corner and just watching that and catcalling him the whole time. But maybe I'll leave that to viewers. And we got a horizon line back there. That is not the right vanishing point. The vanishing point is just behind the head. He has started screaming. He has started... What is going on? He doesn't even look online yet. Although I find this stream often. What is he doing? What is going on?
Well, welcome to the stream. We're back. We're here.
I
here for
really
another
literally
Friday
should just
Friday.
have this on screen,
But
but I'm not
I
figuring
didn't
that out.
Cancel a stream. Pretty exciting. No, I know lately the status quo is that
gonna
I do
kill him.
cancel the streams.
Look at this little
but
guy.
Not today.
All right, fuck you, Gianni. Die. I have not yet. I have completely forgotten that. I had it flagged on my email, and then I think I put it into my MISC section, and then I completely forgot about it. Thank you for reminding me. This is a good time for it because I think we're doing a couple more designs in the shop. He was originally going to do like a YouTube spreadshirt. But it was like fucked. I can't remember what the problem was with Spreadshirt or whatever. Eugene. Oh, Garnet, how long have you been here? Hopefully just the last 5 seconds. On a roll. We like to see it. Well, here, let me keep you updated with what we've done. We did a cute puppy getting hit with a ping pong. I love this one. And we just finished Chet. This fucking guy. The cat face is canonical. This is literally his reference. It's literally in there. All the references I got, he did not have a normal face. He always had the cat face, the McMurray face. Gianni Horde incoming. Oh no. Is he gonna be like, okay, everybody go over here and have the tab open so my wife has extra viewers? Oh lord. We're gonna kill you. I heard him screaming from the other room. There's always something fun going on in that part of the house. Ooh. All right. We're working on the last commission of the day, which will take about an hour. We'll say we started a bit late. Let's get a reference up. Oh, she's so cute. So cute, but capable of so much violence. What I'm doing right now is a mistake. I'm putting down like finalized lines instead of planning more stuff out. But you know what? It might just work. Sometimes it works. Oh, let's get our podcast back up. I usually listen to a podcast in the background, new followers. So if you have to mute me and listen to Gianni, I totally understand. Well, thanks for everybody for dropping in anyway.
But during the Italian campaign, it seemed like jealousy
This little
of the
fella
hero
looking for
worship
violence.
showered on Belisarius had begun to get to the emperor.
Thank you.
His appointment of Narses
It's a
in the
literal
midst of that
PG
campaign
tuber.
as an apparent counterweight to his general had not helped the situation, but neither had Belisarius's treachery in taking Ravenna or the
Fucking
title of Western
Belisarius, I'm
Emperor
telling y'all.
being bandied about. In all the events that have happened recently, I neglected to mention that when 542 arrived, Justinian allowed the office of consul to lapse. The major office of the Roman realm since the beginning of the Republic had of course long ceased to have any real power, but still allowed men like Belisarius to host games, distribute favours, and gain the kind of notoriety that made the emperor suspicious. So the office was absorbed into the cornucopia of imperial titles, much to the chagrin of Procopius and the chattering classes, who
See?
liked all the
Look what I've
symbols
done.
of the long-defunct
I
republican
tried to
system.
put down finalized lines, and now I'm having a hard time with
We
that.
all know some of the thoughts that must have passed through the emperor's mind. He was still a low-born provincial who had risen through palace intrigue to snatch the throne for his uncle. He knew he was hated by the senatorial class for his reforming and streamlining, and of course they had very nearly taken their chance during Nika to unseat him. Theodora, even more protective of her position than her husband, was also apparently spitting venomous thoughts in his ear. But I think we need to add
That's
a
me, I'm
practical
going,
concern to Justinian's paranoia.
That's what it sounds like when I'm spitting
Byzantine
venomous
control of
ideas
the
at Johnny, too.
Mediterranean world was far more precarious than his predecessors enjoyed in centuries past. If Belisarius had decided to set himself up as king of Africa or Italy, Justinian was rightly concerned that there would be little he could do about it. He had only been able to cobble together coalitions of available troops and mercenaries to lead the invasions. He didn't have armies he could just order in to put down a rebellion. And even if he did, the land and sea routes to Italy and Africa were not secure. So the emperor must have lived with a very real fear that the conquests he had fought so hard to make happen could be taken away from him by an ambitious general. The result of this paranoid, or perhaps understandably cautious attitude was disastrous. With badly depleted armies on all fronts, the empire needed good men with authority in charge. Instead, Justinian,
Was a
afraid
little
of men
bitch.
who might be too good at their jobs, began dividing commands to ensure no one could supplant him. The most pressing concern for the Byzantines was, of course, Khusro. Having abandoned his plans for an invasion of Palestine in 542, the King of Kings decided to stick to targets closer to home. In the campaign season of 543, he invaded Byzantine Armenia.
No.
The armies of the east had stayed together while they received new commanders, and were apparently able to muster, despite the plague, 30,000 men for the defence. However, when plague broke out in the Sassanid army, and Khusro learnt of a revolt by one of his sons, he returned to Ctesiphon. Justinian, sensing the chance to deal a damaging blow, ordered his men to invade, while there was still some summer left. However, the men who had been appointed in the east to replace Belisarius and Buzes were not as experienced, nor had either been given the kind of senior position which would enable an effective joint invasion. The attack went ahead, but the disorderly invasion was easily ambushed by a smaller Persian force and driven back across the border. The following year, 544, Khusro was back in person to lead an attack on Edessa, one of the great cities of Syria, while another army invested Theodosiopolis in Byzantine Armenia. The King of Kings put his resources behind building a huge mound, which would rise as high as Edessa's walls, and then could slowly be moved close enough to attack from. The Edessians were given little support from the once more divided imperial army, but
See
they
if I can
proved
get away
equal
with
to the
some
challenge,
stylized thingies.
digging underneath their walls and the Persian mound before setting fire to it.
No!
Angry at the failure of his scheme, Khusro made a couple of furious direct assaults to try and salvage the situation, to no avail. Finally, he accepted 500 pounds of gold to return home. At the same time, the siege of Theodosiopolis had to be abandoned after the Duke of
They
Mesopotamia,
got afraid of women
John
again.
Troglita, led a daring
That's
night
okay.
assault on the Persian camp. By 545, Yersinia Pestis had made its way to Ctesiphon and the other major Persian
The
cities.
pull towards Quake is strong.
Finally doing some good for the Byzantines, the outbreak encouraged Khusro to accept a 5-year truce, which the empire badly needed. They had to pay for the privilege, though. Even with the plague raging, the Sassanids knew they held the upper hand, and Justinian
I started
sent
pulling out the waxing
2,000
strips
pounds
and they
of
all went,
gold
oh my god.
to
No.
ensure that the truce stuck. Lazica, though, was excluded from the terms.
It's okay,
As
I'm
I
scared of
mentioned
everything all the
before,
time too.
The kingdom bordered
Based.
the Black Sea, and the Byzantines could not countenance a Persian fleet being built on the sea which led to Constantinople.
Holy
we will
shit,
return
dummy
to
guy.
events in the north in the next episode.
Minty, go to bed.
Across
have a good
the
one, Eugene.
empire, the harvests for 546 were
Hope I
disastrous,
didn't miss him.
and as famine gripped Constantinople, the pay for the praesental armies was delayed, which led to serious riots from soldiers close enough to actually threaten Justinian's throne.
Yo, hell yeah, more riots, yeah!
Similar public anger in Alexandria led to the state-sponsored patriarch Zoilus fleeing the city for his life. While the following year fighting broke out again between the Blues and Greens in the capital, the first such instance since Nika. While Justinian clung on grimly at home, the situation in Italy turned into a disaster. Things had started to go wrong for the Byzantines the moment Belisarius left Ravenna back in 540. Justinian didn't assign a new overall commander for the armies, instead leaving 5 different men in charge. These commanders, who included the veteran Bessus and John the nephew of Vitalian, did not cooperate and squabbled over how best to subdue the remaining Goths who lived north of the Po River. For their part, the Goths were understandably angered by Belisarius's deception and elected a new king to continue the war. But he was assassinated shortly afterwards, as was his successor. But third time's the charm, the next king of the Goths was a talented leader and good soldier named Totila. Totila was born in the Italian town of Treviso and was a relative of Theudis, the current king of the Visigoths in Spain. We don't know how old he was, but he seems to have been in the prime of life. His 2 recently deceased predecessors had been unsure whether to go on fighting the seemingly unstoppable imperial forces or whether to try and cut a deal with them. Totila chose to fight and won the support of those around him to continue the struggle against the Byzantines. The imperial forces should have had the numerical superiority to bring the Goths to heel, but as I've already hinted, without an overall commander, they squandered the opportunity.
Well, they should have invested in a mommy
In 541, an imperial army about 12,000 strong marched on Verona, driving Totila's men away from the city. A successful piece of espionage got Byzantine agents into the city, ready to open the gates, but the commanders of the army dallied too long,
They fucked it
and
up!
the Goths inside Verona discovered the plot and shut them out. Soon Totila's army returned and defeated them. Spurred on by this victory, Totila followed the retreating army to Faventia and defeated them again. A third and key victory was then secured the following spring near Florence, where the army under the command of John was routed. The victory opened up the centre of the country to the Goths. The various Byzantine commanders retreated to fortified towns like Spoletium, Perusia, Ravenna, and of course
Spaghettium.
Rome, while Totila had the run of the countryside. The imperial forces had essentially surrendered their advantage. Totila's united army was now the largest force in the country, which it wouldn't have been had they worked together. The Gothic king now showed his true understanding of the situation. As he marched around the country taking back towns, he spread a seductive message. He promised the tenant farmers and peasants that he would break up the great estates
What are they
and
doing
distribute the
outside?
land amongst
They're
them.
dragging an entire cement
He promised an end to the exploitation of Justinian's tax collectors, who had already spread out across Italy to begin
This
bringing
turned
the
out a
peninsula
lot better
back into the
than I thought it
imperial
would.
system.
Now let's get it even
He set
better.
slaves free if they would fight for him. He offered Byzantine soldiers generous terms if they would desert. He reminded the Italians of how good life had been under Theodoric, contrasting Gothic rule with that of the Greeks.
Greeks.
Many Italians had no memory of empire. Their experience of rule from Constantinople had only been ruinous war, and what Totila was saying made a lot of sense.
We got more
At the
sparkles
same
here.
time that the Gothic king was winning hearts and minds, Justinian was ignoring them. The soldiers in the west were the last to be paid, and many of those in Italian
That's nice,
garrisons
thank you.
began to wonder if the emperor had forgotten about them. Meanwhile, by capturing the center of the country, Totila was able to collect tax revenue himself to support his men. He also went about destroying the walls of towns he captured to prevent the Byzantines from reoccupying them.
How will I do
Totila's next
this?
target was Naples. He set up a siege in late 542 while his men took back the south of the country. Justinian did respond at this stage by appointing a civilian administrator, Maximin, to take charge of Italy. But there was little he could do with his forces so spread out. 2 attempts were made to relieve Naples by sea, but both failed. And by May 543, the starving citizens agreed to throw open the gates. Totila wisely chose clemency to prove to everyone that he was a man of his word.
I'm a man of my word, guys.
Not only did he reclaim the city peacefully, but he kept his promise to provide safe passage for the garrison who surrendered and headed north to Rome. With the war already going terribly for the Byzantines, the plague now arrived.
You-
Both sides were hit, of course, but for the unpaid, isolated garrisons of the imperial army, trapped in towns which encouraged colonies of rats, things were looking grim. It was to
Damn.
the Eternal City that
Not my
Totila
problem.
looked for his next prize, and as he began making plans to besiege it, the 5 commanders of imperial forces all signed a letter which they sent back to Constantinople in January 544, telling their master that they could no longer effectively defend Italy. This must have pained Justinian, who had pushed so hard to reclaim the old home province. Against Theodorus' protests, he turned back to Belisarius and ordered him to head to Italy to take charge of the situation. To add salt to the empire's already tender wounds, Africa burst into revolt in 543. The general Solomon had overseen peace for many years before his foolish son Sergius massacred some local chiefs, leading to an understandable uprising by the tribe concerned. The plague had hit Carthage and the surrounding towns earlier that year, and the already undermanned province was now in serious danger. When Solomon was killed in the resulting battle, almost all of the tribes along the border took the chance to raid and in some cases capture Byzantine settlements. It would take 2
It's free
years
real
before
estate. I don't see the
Justinian
problem.
could even scrape together some reinforcements. On every front, then, the optimism of the 530s had given way to the despair of the 540s. Everywhere Justinian turned, his plans were crumbling, just like the building projects he'd commissioned, which no longer had men to work on them. When looking at the symptoms of the plague, I mentioned how those who contracted it but survived were often left with some mark of its presence. Whether it was scars, a limp, or slurred speech, our sources also report that many just suffered from lethargy. The fight with Yersinia had robbed them of the energy and vigour they once possessed. Whether for better or worse, you could not say that of Justinian. A workaholic before the plague, a workaholic afterwards. Now in his 60s, and with his dreams of restoring Roman glory hanging by a thread, the emperor refused to give in. He would continue to fight for the goals he had set himself, even if he had to count every penny personally and drag the wounded empire towards the finish line. In 2 weeks' time, the emperor's struggles continue, and so do the wars. Once again, I'd like to say a huge thank you for buying this episode. I'm really hopeful that the sale will raise enough to take us beyond Justinian's reign,
I didn't do nothing.
and I will
bro.
update you as we go. But
This
with
was
his
just here.
determination to keep on living and making history, we've got a good few episodes left. As ever, you can reach me on Facebook or at thehistoryofbyzantium.com.
Alrighty. The next episode, The Nightmare Decade.
Take a fast ship with 2 sets of oars, a square sail, and take to sea.
He's in my ears.
For you must pass many kingdoms, dominions young and vibrant. Go south on falcon's wings, around the tip of Greece, and employ the oars to take you north, avoiding the urge to tally in Athens. Pass it by and cross the Aegean, as if you are Alexander, breaking into the empire of Darius. Go past Ephesus, past Pergamon, and even the remains of ancient Troy. The land masses shall come close together, funneling your tiny ship to a single spot, as if your destination was meant all along to be where sea and land touch. Some see the center of the world, an entrance to a great sea. You take the same journey as Jason and his Argonauts. No, no, you are not to run past the clashing walls.
You can't
Your
run.
journey
You
has
can't
ended
run from my
here.
audio session.
You shall know it by the walls that rise up upon the shore. 27 towers, 2 landward gates protect the city. It is called Constantinople, the city of Constantine. Altars bright with gold, imperial city upon a blue-lit sea. You are not alone, for from your ship you see that all ships head to one place, to the center spot of a Phoenix empire. This is Rob Kane of Ancient Rome Refocused. Let Robin Pearson be your guide when you enter
I love this.
Byzantium.
Hell yeah, dude. Oh, who let that guy in my recording studio? I don't know who that was.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the History of Byzantium, Episode 29, The Nightmare Decade. If somehow you missed the news, episode 28 of the podcast is not part of the free feed, but is up for sale at thehistoryofbyzantium.com. I'm using it as a fundraiser to try and ensure that I can make the podcast part of my work life and to story on beyond Justinian's reign. The initial response has been good, and I'm hugely grateful to those of you who've bought the episode. I'm even more grateful to those who donated more than they had to, and especially sympathetic to those who had to be patient while I overcame some technical glitches. It's been a good learning curve, and I'm hopeful that we are on course to raise enough. But we wait for those who aren't listening live yet to catch up and see if they want to contribute too, and I will keep you all informed as we go forward. Last time on the podcast, we saw Justinian rise from his apparent deathbed, having shaken off his battle with Yersinia Pestis, to find that the glorious Roman Empire he was attempting to restore had been devastated by the plague. The emperor had to immediately pull out deep austerity measures in order to pay his armies, who had to continue fighting on every front. Now, doesn't that sound like a story you would want to hear for the low, low price of $5?
Oh, it does, Robin, it does.
It's certainly not an uplifting story. In fact, since 539 turned into 540, the news for Justinian and the Byzantines has been nothing but terrible. Khusro's invasion of the east and the sack of Antioch was swiftly followed by news that the Goths had undone Belisarius's work in Italy and were on the offensive. Then the plague changed everything. Suddenly all was chaos, famine, and death. Expensive war on the Eastern Front continued. Africa broke into revolt. The war in Italy turned disastrous, and the Slavs and Bulgars were making dangerous noises on the Danube. It should be obvious
They were
by
sitting on the
now
Danube going,
why I called this episode The Nightmare Decade. Today we take the story forward from 545 to 550 as the painful crawl toward recovery begins. We pick up the story in Italy, where the new Gothic king Totila had used a combination of good generalship and savvy PR to turn the Italian countryside into his domain. The remaining Byzantine troops had been driven back to the fortified coastal cities like Rome and Ravenna, while the Goths retook the majority of the country. In despair at what was being lost, the emperor turned again to Belisarius.
Belisarius.
Temporarily in disgrace, the general was ready to resume his duties and head back to the country he had so nearly conquered 4 years previously. Unfortunately, as I explained last episode, the empire was in no real position to raise new armies, and it's doubtful if the suspicious Justinian would have wanted to give Belisarius the kind of force he would need to crush the Goths. So Belisarius made his way to Illyricum and recruited 4,000 troops from the army there before sailing to Ravenna in September 544. As soon as he'd arrived, though, news reached them that the Bulgars were on the move again and had raided Illyricum. The troops who had just made the crossing insisted on heading home immediately to see if they still had homes to return to. Belisarius was now in command of the army of Italy, but had no actual army to do much with, as it was spread around, garrisoning the remaining imperial strongholds. During the campaign season of 544, Totila had secured control of the Flaminian Way, which linked Ravenna and Rome, and had begun a siege of the Eternal City. Belisarius knew that he had to do something to save Rome, but would have to sail all the way around the peninsula to get there. As he made his way down the coast, he was able to relieve a few besieged towns, but everywhere he put in, he found morale at rock bottom, with troops who hadn't been paid in a year, and stories of men slipping through the gates to find Totila and join his army.
Oh.
He wrote to Justinian explaining that without money and reinforcements, there was little he could do. Surprisingly, Belisarius gave this letter to John, the nephew of Vitalian, who he'd already had serious problems with during the first Italian campaign. And sure enough,
John took his sweet time in getting to Constantinople and coming back. However, when he did return in summer 545, he brought around 5,000 men with him. Once again, though, he refused to cooperate with his general.
Fucking John!
Belisarius' plan was to make an amphibious assault from Portus, the port of Rome, while Bessus, inside the city, would distract the Goths with a sortie, and then John would march up and fall on the besieging Goths. Instead, John marched south, insisting on recapturing the towns that had been lost before moving north, and Bessus refused to let his men out of the city, fearing they would simply be cut down. Left alone to carry out the plan, Belisarius launched a fleet up the Tiber in an attempt to at least resupply the garrison of Rome. The assault failed, though not for lack of preparation. Procopius tells the familiar tale that one of Belisarius's sub-commanders disobeyed orders, leading the general to fear that Portus had been taken, which, if true, would have meant his wife Antonina was amongst the captured or killed. When he returned, she was fine, but the chance to reach Rome was gone. The siege of Rome continued for another year, with Bessus allowing any civilians who wanted to leave to abandon their homes and wander miserably through the countryside looking for refuge. In the end, it was an Isaurian soldier who agreed to turn traitor and open the gates in December 546. Bessus and his remaining men fled, and Totila marched into the practically abandoned city. With Rome in his possession, the Gothic king wrote to Justinian asking for peace. Bar the few remaining Byzantine strongholds, he had recaptured most of Italy. He offered to resume the former terms of rule between king and emperor. He would rule in Justinian's name and continue the partnership which Theodoric and Zeno had set up a half-century before. He also darkly hinted that he might destroy Rome if he didn't get his way. And when Justinian refused to even discuss terms, he apparently intended to do just that. Again, according to Procopius, Belisarius intervened, writing to the Gothic king to point out that Rome was still admired by the world for its beauty and legacy.
Yeah, it's alright.
Did Totila want to be remembered as the stupid barbarian who destroyed the greatest city in the world?
Did that
Whether
work?
it was this call from posterity that stayed his hand, or more practical concerns, we don't know. But by spring 547, the king left Rome as he'd found it, and headed south with his army to take back the towns now in the possession of John. Although he left a garrison behind, he did take the precaution of pulling down sections of the Aurelian walls to prevent the Byzantines from retaking the city. So he must have been pretty furious when a few weeks later, news came that as soon as he'd gone, Belisarius had attacked the city, taken it, and patched up the walls. Unable to catch John or dislodge Belisarius, Totila faced his first serious setback in the war. And to add to the good news for the imperial forces, events in Africa now allowed 2,000 extra troops to be sent north to reinforce Rome. In the previous episode, we saw how needless war had broken out across the African prefecture, leading to the death of the governor Solomon and serious trouble for the plague-affected Byzantine army. For 4 years, between 543 and 47, the conflict dragged on, before finally John Troglita, the capable Duke of Mesopotamia, was appointed as sole commander. Initially he fought indecisive battles with the Moors, but soon began to work the old Roman magic of divide and conquer. Befriending tribal leaders and turning them against one another, John was able to win a crushing battle with the most prominent rebellious tribes in 548, which was to leave Africa at peace for another decade. Peace in Africa, though, was no great victory. Conflict shouldn't have broken out there in the first place, and the 2,000 men who arrived in Italy only confirmed the stalemate in that country. Belisarius spent parts of 547 and 48 travelling around the country trying to find a way to win the war, but he couldn't. He didn't have enough men in the peninsula to press the Goths, who themselves were too small a force to successfully starve the Byzantines out. This futile deadlock was benefiting no one. So Belisarius sent his wife Antonina back to Constantinople in the summer of 548. He hoped that her friendship with the Empress Theodora might persuade Justinian to send the troops he badly needed. However, when Antonina arrived in the capital, it was to the news that Theodora was dead.
No.
The Empress had been in her late 40s, and the historical consensus suggests that it was cancer. Justinian went into sincere and public mourning for his beloved
Thank you.
wife, and never would marry again.
Oh, wife guy.
A procession of Constantinople's notable citizens walked past the Empress as she lay in state, and when the Emperor approached to put a necklace on her, he broke down in tears.
Oh.
It's a fascinating part of Justinian's story that here was a man who refused to bend in the face of his minister's advice, or in the face of common sense, some might say, as he strove to restore the Roman Empire.
Once again, Theodora
And yet
was
he would
actually
bend for
originally a
Theodora,
prostitute.
and publicly credited her with helping to shape policy or amend laws. From an imperial point of
Like
view,
talk about like
you
whoa.
wonder if he should have listened.
The
Knowing what really went
theatrical
on behind closed
Byzantine
doors is
Empire.
hard to ever
Pretty cool.
ascertain, but from what we do know, there were times when the Empress harassed men who would have served the empire well.
Yeah, well, sometimes
During
men
the
deserve
darkest
it.
days of the plague, men like Belisarius, John the Cappadocian, and Germanus would have been better served undisturbed at their former posts. While by protecting and encouraging the Monophysites, Theodora greatly hindered any hopes of reconciliation between the churches. From a Monophysite's point of view, though, she was their champion. Part of the reason the Empress gets such attention in the historical narratives is that visitors to Ravenna today can still look up and see her fearsome visage staring back at them. You can see the famous mosaics of the Church of San Vital at thehistoryofbyzantium.com on the post which accompanies this episode, or on the Facebook page. The church was begun in the 520s under Gothic rule, but only finished in the 540s when the Byzantines controlled Ravenna. It seems like the leading Orthodox bishop in the city, Maximian, made sure that as the church neared completion, it should honor the imperial couple who now ruled from Constantinople. And it should be noted that Maximian himself gets a prominent placement too. But it's Justinian and Theodora who are most famously captured on either side of the church's apse, overlooking the altar. They are standing, awaiting the Eucharist, the Mass, or Communion, which would take place on that spot, just like the vice-regent of God and his wife should. Justinian carries the bread, Theodora the wine. The mosaic panels are remarkable for many reasons, but two are important for our story. One is that they survived at all. Many great visual representations in the Byzantine world were destroyed during the period of iconoclasm, another religious dispute which will break out in a few centuries' time.
That's
Ravenna, by then lost to the empire,
the fear that
was out of the
having
reaches of
pretty
those who did
objects
not
depicting
wish to see
biblical
God
events
represented
is,
in art.
a case of worshipping idols.
The other is simply the
So
prominent
tons
place
and tons
of
of art was
Theodora
lost,
in the
melted down.
representation. The Empress is tall, stern, and powerful looking, given essentially equal place alongside her husband. We know that back in the capital, only the Emperor would have been allowed to stand alongside the clergy during the liturgy, so the Empress's elevation is something of an anachronism. It seems like Bishop Maximian was well aware of how powerful the Empress was, and if she was likely to hear of the beautiful new depiction of her in Ravenna, then she might well look kindly on the man who made it happen. Unfortunately for Maximian, the church was consecrated
Oh, I
just
believe that.
before news arrived that the Empress had
Bit
taken
of a
bread and
Protestant
wine
L, in my opinion.
for the last time. For Antonina, the situation looked hopeless. Justinian had other things on his
But part of me
mind
is also
and
like,
didn't
oh,
seem
maybe
likely
they're
to
right.
offer
But
her
also,
husband
nah,
any
come on,
help
I'm
in
not
Italy.
nervous.
By the following
I'm
year,
also
though,
not
she had
religious, but
successfully
I like to have
lobbied to
opinions
have
on things.
Belisarius recalled. The general returned to the capital in 549 to a warm greeting from
Yeah.
the bereaved emperor.
Yeah, it wasn't like the
and then
Baroque
retired
era,
from
like
military
just before
service.
the rise of Protestantism, and
He
everybody was
left
like,
the world
"Oh, this
stage
is
a rich
disgusting!
and
All this
successful
gold
man.
everywhere."
But to contemporaries and posterity alike, the question aimed at him would always be, what might have been? Belisarius left Rome to be held by 3,000 men.
Oh,
But to
held by
underline the
3,000
futility
men,
of
huh?
the war in Italy, the Eternal City changed hands for the 4th time in early 550, when once again Isaurian soldiers, who hadn't been paid in months, betrayed the gates to Totila. In the meantime, Justinian appointed Liberius, the career bureaucrat whose career keeps getting more amusing, to be the new commander in Italy. Now, to be fair, Liberius was an Italian, so the appointment had that going for it.
Italians.
But he was now in his mid-70s, with no significant military experience at all. He made his way to Sicily with a few troops, only for Totila to cross to the island and set up the
your
identical
way into heaven,
stalemate
yeah.
that existed on the mainland. Imperial forces in the
Yeah.
coastal towns, Goths in the
Yeah,
countryside.
you get it. You get it.
It was only by 550 that Justinian felt the empire's resources were restored enough that he could contemplate the creation of an army that could actually finish the war in Italy. With recruits from the western field armies and other mercenary forces, the army gathered in Salona and was given a proper commander, the emperor's cousin Germanus. With Theodora gone, Germanus was free to assume the role that had always seemed his, the heir apparent. By winning the war in Italy, he could return home and fully expect to be seen as the next emperor, should Justinian pass away. To bolster his chances of winning over the Goths, he married Matasuntha, the daughter of Amalasuntha, and therefore granddaughter to Theodoric. Everything seemed to be lining up for Germanus when
Everything's
suddenly he
coming up,
fell ill and
Germanus.
died
Oh,
in the summer of 550.
bye, bitch.
Together with the loss of its commander, the army left behind in Dalmatia had to deal with a massive Slavic invasion of the area. 3 years earlier, a major raid through Illyricum had been identified for the first time as being Slavic only, having nothing to do with their Bulgar neighbours. The raiders had captured several fortified towns during their stay, which was a worrying development for the Byzantines. The following year, in 548, another Slavic party crossed the Danube, defeated the garrison guarding the settlement of Topyrus, and sacked it. The invasion in 550 saw an even larger group attempt to carry off the wealth of the empire, but they were surprised by the large imperial army blocking their path through Dalmatia. The group moved east to avoid battle, and the leaderless army chose to maintain their position rather than chase after the intruders, who were now loose in the Balkans. With these major blows to Justinian's morale and planning, we end the Nightmare Decade on the western front
You know,
and
gestures.
turn east.
Yeah.
But before we do,
As
I
I
feel
learn more
should
and more
pass
about
on an
history, the
amusing
more
story.
I don't know if respect is the right word, but well, no, I guess respect and understand like the drive, if that's the right turn of phrase. But like I get it a bit more about why you might want to be entrusting yourself to a higher power. I definitely respect that a lot more than I did when, going through the edgy atheist phase. I didn't really have an edgy atheist phase. I guess I just had a point where I didn't really want to go to church anymore. But, yeah, as you grow older, you kind of figure a little bit more stuff out, I think. Anyway.
That came out of Justinian's negotiations with the Slavs. The Byzantines were still unsure at this stage with exactly who they were dealing with, and identified two different Slavic peoples living beyond the Danube, who they called
I'm
the
also like
Antai
more
and
annoyed
the
as I learn more about
Sclavines.
history. Like, oh, that's why everybody's
As he
fighting?
did with most tribes beyond the border, Justinian tried to
And then
bring
also
them
realizing,
into
oh, it's
the
not about
imperial
religion, it's about,
diplomatic system.
access to
During
food, wealth,
negotiations
etc.
with the Antai,
the Slavic representatives announced that they had found
Just fun
Chilbudius,
stuff, though.
the former commander of the Imperial
Sorry,
Army
wait.
in Thrace,
What was
being
his name?
held capturing them into the imperial diplomatic system. During negotiations with the Anti, the Slavic representatives announced that they had found Chilbudius, the former commander.
Chilbudius? Yeah. 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 Okay, but back to Chilbudius here. They have to bring those old names back. There's like so many old, like Justinian, and I'm sure a lot of those things or names exist in Greece now, but like Chilbudius, come on.
Of the Imperial Army in Thrace, being held captive by the Sclavenes.
No, not Chilbudius.
You may remember that Chilbudius,
No.
who may well have been of Slavic origin, was apparently killed in battle back in the 530s.
Yeah.
The anti-diplomats continued that they'd be more than happy to do a deal with the Empire, but they would like Chilbudius restored to his former position. The man they presented did speak Latin fluently, but quite how they thought they were going to get away with this is unknown, as indeed is the fate of the man who they handed over to imperial officials, still claiming that it was the long-dead general. I sincerely hope some of that actually happened, and that Chilbudius, while talking to the suspicious officials, inquired as to what exactly the Emperor's policy was on back pay. We return now to 545, but on the Eastern Front, where the 5-year truce was signed with the Sassanids. Justinian badly needed peace, and never had a problem paying Khusro to stay on his side of the line. In 2 areas, though, the fighting continued throughout the decade. The less immediately important struggle for us was that between the Lakhmid and
How was that
Ghassanid
recorded with a
Arabs
straight face?
in the
He is a
Syrian
professional.
desert.
My man Robin is a
It had
professional.
taken Harith of the Ghassanids a few years to exert his control over the tribes in his area, but slowly they became more adept at defeating their Persian-sponsored neighbours. The Lakhmids
I
had
believe
enjoyed
you.
raiding imperial territory in the 520s and 530s, and hostilities with the Ghassanids became more bloody the more able Harith became at blocking their attacks on Syria. Things became darkly personal in 545 when Mundir,
Said
the
that
man
you're
best known to
stinky.
you for sacrificing Byzantine nuns to his deity,
Oh,
captured one of Harith's sons in battle. He too was killed in honor of the goddess Al-Uzza, and Harith was left to plot bitter revenge on his rival.
ouch. Big ouchie, bro.
The other active theatre of war was in the northern kingdom of Lazica. Lazica was the kingdom which had set off the wars between Persia and Byzantium way back in 527. The Laz were by now a Christian people and had decided to ask for Byzantine protection when Justinian became emperor in order to escape Persian domination. After a war was fought to secure a protectorate over his country, the Laz king Gubazes decided that he could now get a better deal from the Persians after hearing about the sack of Antioch in 540.
He's probably
The
right.
Persians marched in and took control of the country and the key port city of Petra. The Byzantines couldn't allow the Persians access to the Black Sea, but their plague-ravaged armies were in no position to do anything about it until 548. By then, Gubazes was once more thinking about a U-turn. He and his people found the Persians more distasteful overlords than they'd expected, and he asked Justinian to restore Byzantine
Maybe
protection.
the human sacrifice did it.
With the worst of the financial crisis over, Justinian was able to send 7,000 men under the commander of the army of Armenia, Dagestheus. Joining up with the Laz army, the combined forces drove out the Sassanid troops guarding the passes back to Persia, but couldn't take Petra. The Persians counterattacked in 549 and 550, and although the Laz Byzantine forces kept them out, they did succeed in resupplying the garrison at Petra. The Byzantines closed the decade besieging the city, proud to have seen off the Persian occupation, but watching the horizon to see if Khusro would send more men against them later on.
While Justinian juggled wars, financial crises, and famine, he also turned his mind once more to the problem of the Monophysites. It can be difficult to understand the mindset of people who lived hundreds of years ago, and it says a great deal that with so much already heaped on his plate, the emperor saw the unity of his church as one of his highest priorities. Perhaps he even felt that the plague and accompanying disasters were signs that it still wasn't high enough. Justinian had always been keenly interested in theology, and so looked for an intellectual solution to the issue, not a political compromise, as had been the case with Zeno's Henoticon. You may recall that soon after Nika, the emperor invited distinguished Monophysites to come to the capital and debate their differences with clergy who supported the Council of Chalcedon. Now with the plague subsiding, Justinian
Reminder,
began to...
Monophysites believe in only the divine nature of Christ. Like, he has only one nature, and that is godly, whereas I think the current time in Byzantium, he has like a human aspect and a holy aspect. It's a little weird.
put into practice some of the ideas which emerged from those discussions.
Monophysites would not have asked if Jesus
Justinian had
was a
noted
boobs
that
or
one
an
of the
ass man,
Monophysite
as I
objections
said
to
earlier.
Chalcedon was that the ecumenical council had tolerated the contributions and theology of three men who were associated with Nestorius. Now, Nestorian Christianity is the teaching which emphasizes the division of Jesus' humanity and divinity, the polar opposite of what the Monophysites argued, which, as you know, was the one nature of Christ.
He's explained it.
Justinian concluded that if he could have these three men condemned, and thus remove the taint of their Nestorianism from the Council of Chalcedon, then the Monophysites would once more be able to join their Orthodox brethren around this statement of belief. Everyone agreed that Nestorius' teachings were heretical, and his supporters had long been pushed out of the empire. It was a thoughtful solution to the issue, and one the emperor hoped would be able to please everyone. But as is becoming a familiar refrain, the condemnation of the so-called three chapters was welcomed by no one. The compliant patriarchs of the East accepted the edict with some reluctance, but the news caused dismay amongst the clergy of Italy and Africa. They had no interest in seeing Chalcedon edited in this way, and were worried about the precedent of besmirching long-dead and respected churchmen who could no longer defend themselves. The sitting pope, Vigilius, was caught in an unenviable position. He had been forcibly removed from the many sieges of Rome and transported to Constantinople by 548. The Pope was sympathetic and no doubt intimidated by Justinian's proposals, but knew that his own position in the West would be hopelessly undermined if he caved in. So he delayed and got into arguments with the Patriarch and wore on Justinian's already shredded patience. The Pope would end the decade still refusing to give in to imperial demands, and would eventually take refuge in a church, where the citizens of the capital looked on in horror as Justinian's soldiers tried to drag the Vicar of Christ off against his will. They eventually let him be, and the emperor was forced to negotiate with his pontiff, ending the decade no closer to a solution to the church's divisions. The 530s had been a decade of optimism, growth, and success for the empire. The 540s had been a disaster. Amidst all the ruin and misery, Justinian had clung grimly on, and the empire would emerge into the 550s still intact, with its economy functioning and its army still fighting. The emperor deserves credit for keeping the state together in the face of these trials, but he also deserves the blame for some of that misery, particularly when imperial tax collectors pushed on in the face of people whose lives had been turned upside down. The emperor had never been a beloved figure, and now many were nursing very real reasons to resent him. However, his control of the state remained firm, and as the empire recovered some of its former strength in the next decade,
Justinian would continue to single-mindedly pursue his ambitions. With Theodora gone, the emperor would be married to his work from now on. While you are waiting the next 2 weeks for more history of Byzantium, why not check out Rob Kane's podcast, Ancient Rome Refocused?
Ancient
It's a
Rome
fascinating
refocused.
blend of storytelling,
I don't think
interviews,
I will.
cultural analysis, and exploration of the Republic and early empire.
Wrong. I think I'll just switch to a little bit of music. We got, I'll probably spend another 5 minutes on this bad boy and then wrap up just after 5. Let's see. Okay, I'm just putting on a random ambient mix. There we go. Want to get the focus back on Raven here. Let's try. Oh, wait, forgot she had little tails. Little, coattails, I guess. How could I forget? I'm literally gonna, like, finish my stream and then go over to Gianni's stream and just neg him. Neg him while doing work. Got a couple more things I want to wrap up tonight because tomorrow I will be at my lifeguarding course again. Oh! I just remembered I had homework for that course. Oh no! Something easy, a worksheet. I'm sure I'll have no problems with it, but oh. Bars on the tops and the bottoms here. Then maybe call it quits. Yeah, homework. Oh! See you later, Aransika. Blah. I'm so good at pronouncing everybody's usernames. Thanks for dropping in. Good luck on your homework. Oh wait, she's got a couple little gems too. That we gotta get. This layer. It's such a good character design. I'm so mad about it. All my commissioners have the coolest character designs. I'm gonna kill them. Maybe too many shines. Unless I want more shines, just shine it up. Who cares? Yeah. All right. I am getting better at this whole sketching thing. Oh, if I play my cards right. Just wait until I'm done with this next round of client work. Then I'll be playing my cards. Excellent. Okay, wait. There we go. Ugh, I'm excited to show everybody what I've been working on. Like perfect, like in my wheelhouse work with a game dev. For the past couple of weeks, I got a couple more characters to design, but like they're giving me 3D models based on the turnarounds that I'm doing for them. Like the 3D modeler for one is like god tier. This guy's so fast, and he's able to show off some really great models based off of my work, which is so neat to have that again. I've had that happen a couple times with my other work, but this is like 6 to 10 characters that are getting done. You made Gianni say the creature dialogue about playing Fortnite and drinking cola as Gabriel. I'm gonna have to catch it in the VOD. Wild. You took a small nap, didn't kill your energy levels, and it didn't knock you out until midnight. Okay. You just have to stay awake until about 9 p.m., sweetheart, and then you can go to bed. Oh, did you try and share a link, Cook? Let's see. I'm gonna see really quick if I can actually let you share that link. If not, if you have Twitter, just add it on Twitter and I'll find it. Unless I can go to Gianni's stream and just grab that link, can I? Isn't that something that Twitch does? We are about to get blasted by Gianni sound right now. I don't know how to do it. My ass is stupid.
Hey, thanks, Split 420, for 500 bits to just say Gianni's majestic eyebrows.
So true.
I'm okay with this bit.
Let me tell him he has very cute eyebrows. You have very cute, majestic eyebrows.
I know, I'll walk past the quad to try to gauntlet them as they are LGing me down a straight fucking hallway. So basically what I'm trying to say, everybody, is I will be participating in the Quake Live Project Velocity esports tournaments in the future.
Alright, silence Gianni. I'm actually going to raid you guys over to him if I can remember that button. Let's see. Excuse me. The clip is entitled Yippee! He does have thick eyebrows. They're so cute. Alright. Keep that idea handy, Wild. I think all next week I'm going to do the same thing. I'm still deciding whether or not I want to do the full week next week, but I do kind of like it, and I do kind of want to see if I can do another one of these. But we'll see. I'll see how I feel about my current client work too. Maybe I should catch up more on that workload. Wish I could have joined sooner, but it is what it is. Well, I appreciate you coming out every time there, Garnet. And you, Rad Beetle, thank you for popping in. I hope you're feeling better. If you're not, I'm going to come over there. Make you feel better. With violence. I will be sending out all the commissions in a couple hours or so. Maybe I want to patch them up, although I think I hit it out of the park with all 3 of these today, so maybe I will send them off presently. But let me get that raid button to Gianni going, and we shall see. I know how to do this. But I'm feeling crap. Geeks, come over, then... Okay. Yeah, I didn't read that top bit. Oh, you're still feeling like crap? I'm coming over. Miss Ebola, you sent the payment already. Thank you, Queen. You're way ahead of me. I did not send you a link. You instinctively know. I see that extra friggin' a couple little dollars on top of that. I see that, Miss Ebola. Very sneaky. All right, no one distract me. Raid. I know how to do this. I'm so good at it. Mod view. No, wait.
Guys, you have to be nice to me. I can't remember how to raid people over. Okay, wait.
Isn't it like exclamation point raid in chat? Let's try this. No, wait. I'm looking it up. My ass is so stupid. Dash raid. You can absolutely, if you have me out on Discord, I'm Perennial Astronaut on Discord. I'll probably open all my Discord messages and actually look at what people have been sending me. /raid, get Gianni. Okay, we're doing it. Thank you, everybody. I will catch you over on Gianni's stream for a little while. Goodbye, sort of. All right. And then I'll switch mine to the break.